here.
Yep, and let's confirm with Zoom audience that they can hear us. Let's confirm with Zoom audience that they can hear us. Anyone who is on Zoom, if you could confirm that you could hear us, that would be great.
Good morning, everyone.
This is Dr. Campbell. I can hear you.
Amy, are you on? Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Oh, there she is. There you are. Hi, Amy. Can you hear us? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Michael, can you hear us? And Amrita? We're always so excited how much you've accomplished over the year. I think the new interns, as you look and see how accomplished everybody is and how polished their presentations are, I know it's hard to imagine that this will be you in a year, but it will. That's one of the wonderful things about this program. I think all of the interns who are presenting today can reflect back on the year and how overwhelming it was to learn all this and to imagine how fast you learn and are absorbed into the fabric of this program. We're really trying to integrate care and research and make the experience better for everybody. The whole goal of this is to provide, leadership skills, presentation skills, ability to understand the larger vision for medicine. The reason we integrate care and research is that research are tomorrow's and trials are tomorrow's treatments today. And the only way you can do that is if you imagine a better future and then work to make it happen. That's really what this is all about. And we want to, make sure that is instilled in your brain for decades to come, and that you will follow those patterns as you've heard at the intern retreat, right? You're all part of the Vortex Society. We expect you to come back, and we expect you to take these ideas forward with you and keep them with you throughout your training. I'm so excited that Amy is able to join us. This internship program would not be possible without the Baker Family Leadership Development Program. Amy really gave us this donation to really help us make sure that we can, that we could support the internship program and make it possible for Anne Marie.
I can't hear.
It looks like they're paused. Nice.
Yeah, I think maybe on their end there's a signal issue.
Yeah, we lost sound.
Power outage. They'll be back.
Okay, got it. All right. Okay. Okay, I think we're good. Are we? Yes, all right, fantastic. All right, can everybody see? Almost? Working on it? All right, we are good. Okay, anyway, I just want to again say, Amy, thank you so much. I know this is in honor of your father, and you know, I can't tell you what an amazing gift that is. It's, I think, giving this to young people is a lifelong gift, and it is all really about learning. So do you want to make a comment a little bit, Bethany?
I just want to say congratulations to everyone, and I'm really honored to be able to help support this wonderful initiative and program that you put together. It's every year I'm always amazed about how wonderful and brilliant you all are. So congratulations.
Well, thanks, and I want to thank actually all of the mentors. You know, this program works because there's a community here that supports you. You have administrative mentors, you have faculty mentors, research mentors, and people put a lot of time into training you because we believe in you and we know that this will impact your futures and everybody else's future. And so think about, it takes a village, and we do provide a village for all of you. And again, Amy, thank you so much for believing in us in this program. All right, so we have a whole series of presentations this morning. There are 10 this morning and 6 this afternoon. We'll take a short lunch break, and we're all excited. And I want to remind all of the interns, you're going to start your presentation with very short, pithy summary of what the most important thing is that you learned this year. So don't forget to do that. Okay, and we're trying to start and have there's a theme about the way we've organized the presentations, and we'll start off with the interns that supported the iSpy trial. Really, this is again about our adaptive platform trial for high risk for women with high risk breast cancer, and how we're trying to accelerate launch turns and get the right treatment to the right person at the right time. And we'll just go right down the line to all the things that we are working on. Well, cancer is not one disease. We're going to start with that. And so developing clinical trials to advance personalized medicine is what is the underlying theme of everything we do with breast cancer. So Sarah, yes, you are up. So I will.
Or you can just use the keyboard. You can use mouse, Sarah.
Yeah.
Just click.
Yeah. Oh, one other, I guess one quick thing. If you're on Zoom, you can unmute and ask questions at the end. And if you're here, just raise your hand and we'll go.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to be kicking us off, but before I start, I'm going to share my one thing that I learned. And the thing that I'm going to say is I learned to not be afraid of bothering or annoying people when you're advocating for a patient, because the people that you bother or annoy, you know, they're going to forget about it, but the patient is going to remember forever. So that's my one thing. And then my presentation today is on patient attitudes towards de-escalation on the iSpy clinical trial. As Dr. Esserman mentioned, we are going to have a lot of presentations on iSpy, so I have a couple extra minutes where I'm going to tell you a bit about the trial. So what is iSpy? iSpy is a neoadjuvant breast cancer clinical trial. What this means is that we're giving treatment to patients before surgery. There are a few different aspects of the iSpy trial that makes it unique. The first is that we do implement personalized medicine. The drugs that are chosen specifically for patient's tumor type. In addition, our trial is very adaptive. So we don't give patients the treatment that's not working. We don't give them patients the treatment that they don't need. But we do, we add on and we subtract based on their responses.
And this is brand new. It started with you. Yes. July is when this phase of we gradually just moved right into it. Yes. Without writing a new protocol.
So one of the things that I want to highlight for my presentation is the de-escalation in I-SPY. So what this means is de-escalation is not giving patients treatment that they don't need. I know the term is a little tricky, but in I-SPY, what this means is with the 3 different treatment blocks, if a patient completes a treatment block, they get an MRI and a biopsy, and if there's no, evidence of remaining tumor, they have the potential to not get the next treatments and go straight to surgery. So that is the concept of de-escalation. This is a topic that is discussed a lot in medicine. I think that sometimes patients feel a little bit worried, or maybe providers, because they want to make sure that the patient gets everything that they need to heal. But you don't want to give patients, if you don't have to give them a drug that has both short-term and long-term side effects, you want to avoid that. Now, I-SPY is discussing, if it works, but my presentation is going to be talking about how patients feel about that, because at the end of the day, their confidence in what they're doing is going to impact their experience. Just as a note, I'm looking specifically at AC, which is the last treatment. Specifically for my presentation, I'm doing that because AC has a lot of known serious side effects long-term with the heart and various things like that. Also, as an extra note, I'm also interviewing some patients from a previous version of the trial that also had this de-escalation point for AC. So just a quick note for my study design. My patients, we did interviews. These were 15 to 30-minute longs. They were qualitative, semi-structured. So what this means is we did have, interview questions and a script, but we also allowed for free-flowing conversation. If there's something a patient really wanted to focus on or talk about, we were allowed to ask follow-up questions and do all of that to really pinpoint their experiences. And in addition, we also had a 5-minute quantitative survey that asked some questions about their decision-making attributes, but also just demographics, which I have here for your reference. So I have done 7 interviews so far. We actually just got another one in, we haven't analyzed yet. This is an ongoing study, so we're gonna have another year. Because of that, I'm going to focus on the identified themes and what we found from that and how that can help impact the rest of our interviews. I'm not gonna focus as much on quantitative because we only have 7 patients. Of the themes that we've identified, there's 2 that I really want to focus on. The first is the patient's experience when they have the option to de-escalate, or when they don't have the option to de-escalate, and how that feels. So specifically, the themes that I'm focusing on are decision involvement. These came up a lot, how involved the patient felt that they were with the decision that was being made. And this ranged from patients saying, we didn't really have a conversation about the pros and cons, I kind of was just moving forward with AC, to some patients did say that they felt very involved. The other thing we sort of discussed is, why patients may want to do AC or might not want to do AC. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of really serious side effects. So there were patients that were saying, I'm really afraid of AC. I want to avoid it as much as possible. I had one patient who said she was just tired. She just wanted a break. She didn't want that hard chemo. On the other hand of this, there are patients who told me they want to do everything they need to survive. And for them, that meant doing all of the treatment that was available. One patient said, my main concern was obviously just my survival chances. And then, there were patients that were neutral. They said that it doesn't matter what I would do. The fear of recurrence would be there regardless. So there is a wide range of how patients feel towards this de-escalation opportunity. The next thing I want to talk about is communication. I think that this is really important because, if this becomes a permanent thing where patients are de-escalating more often, it's important that they feel confident in their decisions, and that's not going to happen if they don't understand what's going on. So this is a theme that I really wanted to look at with my patients that I was talking to. Some of the themes that we focused on was if their questions were being answered, and this did really range between patients. One patient said that she had a bunch of people on her team, and if she didn't understand, they explained it to her. She felt very supported. On the other hand, one patient said that she did have a list of nurses to call, but it didn't seem as helpful and things were not reachable, so she didn't necessarily feel the questions were being answered. The next thing we discussed was setting expectations. One patient said they're oncologist, she was so good at setting expectations. But the other one, other patients said that they maybe didn't feel like they knew what was going to happen. One patient said, I thought I knew what my MRI results would be before they started scheduling me for AC. So a range there. Some other topics that came up that I thought were interesting was communication between clinic members. This included, if the oncologist and the surgeon were talking to each other, but also, if the oncologist and the nurse, who knew about what the study protocols were. So one patient said that she got a 1-sentence email from my chart from someone she hadn't met. that just said the MRI looks good. If this MRI was at a time point which was going to be really impactful towards their decisions, she didn't really feel like it was super helpful. She didn't know who she could talk about what was going to happen next. The next thing I wanted to talk about was CRC usefulness. CRC is a clinical research coordinator. That's something that I was for iSpy, as most of the interns here are CRCs in some capacity. Patients said that they really enjoyed having a CRC because it was useful to have that one point of contact to answer questions because things were overwhelming. On the other hand, not having a good CRC seemed to make the situation worse. One patient said that she had a CRC that was replaced who just wasn't very good and didn't communicate, and it created stress for her. So a lot of themes, this is just, skimming the pool of all of the things that came up during these 7 interviews, and we're going to get even more. But what do I want to do next? Of course, I'm going to continue interviews throughout the next year. Our goal is at least 20. But before I do these interviews, I really want to stop and pause and refine the survey questions and make sure that they're really targeting the things that we discussed. And importantly, those things that we discussed, making sure how can we fix them? What do the patients think would be useful? And for the things that were good, how can we make sure that they're still happening? So we'll refine the survey and interview questions, continue interviews. And I also want to talk to oncologists because I think that their insights will be very valuable. And then finally, with all of the data that we get, we want to create concrete interventions to make these experiences good for the patients. This will be specifically in the iSpy trial. We already have some things like a letter that is given to the patient and encouragements within the trial to make sure that providers are talking to patients. But we want to refine these, maybe make some more. And then the idea is that, once iSpy is complete, we can take the things that we use within iSpy and provide them to the real world as educational materials or resources. So I just want to thank Dr. Gabrielle Roque, Alexis Coley, Susan O'Neill, Kara Connolly. They have all been so great in helping with setting up the protocol and answering my questions and being supportive. Just for reference, my cited sources and resources about de-escalation are there. Otherwise, thank you so much.
One of the things that you've identified just in those few surveys is did everyone's experience the same?
Definitely not.
Okay, so some places it seems like we've got it down, and other places it's not. So one of the things that we have in the trial to standardize that is what?
We have something called an ROR time point. There is a letter that is generated for the patient that has, this is what your MRI and biopsy showed. This is what we recommend. The CRC is responsible for bringing that to an appointment and giving it to the patient, and also having it there as a reminder to the provider to talk to the patient about this. And then as an extra sort of place to make sure, CRCs have to go into our special website and say, did the patient and provider have a conversation? What was that conversation like? So that's hopefully going to bring us a lot of data.
So there's a checklist, right? So when everybody, so that we know, did the patient get the letter? Did the physician agree, or all those things? So one of the things that you can ask in your interviews is what?
Did you get this ROR letter? Did you actually have this conversation? Which we did start doing with these 7 interviews.
So that will help us. And we, of course, are checking to see, the completeness, and we found lots of glitches. But that was the process we put in place to try and standardize this and avoid it. The advocates had that very clever idea of making sure the ROR letter is written in plain language for the patient. Actually helps the physician, because then when they explain it, they can give it. So we found some reasons why that's working. Hopefully that will change. One other interesting piece of data is that in iSpy 2, almost about 25% of patients were able to de-escalate and avoid AC. I think the problem is, when someone says, I just want to do everything, is that evidence-based?
For the patients, that's probably more feelings-based.
For physicians?
There might be some feelings of anxiety on the physician's part.
So they think it's evidence-based, right?
Yes.
And the reason they think it's evidence-based is because for decades, we did adjuvant therapy. So why do you think that would be? Meaning that instead of giving it first, we gave it afterwards, and everybody got the same.
Because once you've done surgery, you can't go back and check again.
So you have no idea who's responding, who's not responding. Everybody got the same thing. So part of the tension is we're changing the paradigm. instead of giving everybody everything and hoping for the best, we're saying what?
We're gonna try and do things before we go to surgery so that we can check.
Who's responding to these?
Yeah.
Targeted. Yes. Yeah, yeah.
So Sarah, this looks really interesting. In case it hadn't crossed your radar, the healthcare field is not terribly good at intervention development. And I come from a field of engineering where they're a little bit better. There's a technique called the Goodwinson technique. Take the data you have, map it on the requirements and specifications from the intervention. And then the world of design is, where intervention development is really kind of thriving. And so I just wanted to point to that in case, now is the time to be thinking about how you're going to structure data collection to inform the development of an intervention. And most healthcare qualitative researchers are relatively descriptive. They've been trained descriptively. They're not really trained prescriptively around developing interventions.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to talk to you.
And Gabrielle.
Yeah. And then the other point is this point about the adaptive nature of this trial. I mean, it's just so true that classical statistics generally reports the results of clinical trials on average. You get comparisons of means and that sort of thing. So in an adjuvant setting, you could look at mean survival might be extended by months or whatever by an adjuvant. But that always refers to this. You always have to think about the distribution of outcomes underneath that mean. That actually is just the central moment on wide distribution of outcomes. And so one way to think about it is that neoadjuvant study is able to actually look on an individual basis each of the patients as their own data point with their own kind of mean response as opposed to have to aggregate across this whole population.
It's very active. Doing one piece, it's one of the program project, that's one of the things that we're really trying to develop. This whole feedback on making sure people get the information they need. Susie is pointing out that the term de-escalation needs to be a more patient-friendly term. We actually came up with one, which I'm brain fog, can't remember what it was. We did come up with a different one that we're supposed to use. But anyway, and Jessica Gibbs also wanted to congratulate you and also just thank Evan,
Yes.
who actually got this former intern, right? As we like to say, this will be a minimum of a 2 intern project, but 3. All right, we're gonna move on anyway. Thank you so much. Tammy is up next.
Hi everyone, my name is Kemi. Before I get started, I'd like to say that the one lesson that I learned this year was that both emotionally and professionally, your relationships with every single person you meet matter. Like Sarah mentioned, iSpy is all about optimizing the patient experience, really taking information from each patient's therapy and trying to see how we can improve the next patient. And one of those ways that we do that is through adverse event collection. So my project is all about optimizing adverse event data collection by integrating ePRO's patient surveys into clinic and CRC workflow. Okay, so an understanding of the problem, of course, requires an understanding of the status quo. So this little graphic describes that. Every week, iSpy patients report their symptoms to several different parties in several different ways. The first way that we all know about is through follow-up appointments, whether this is with medical oncologists or nurse practitioners. They also receive MyChart messages from iSpy coordinators and triage nurses asking further questions about their symptoms. And then finally, iSpy patients are also sent weekly surveys through ePRO surveys, again assessing their symptoms. This can happen again as often as every week, reporting the same thing to many different parties, and is generally a very inefficient system, as we may see right here. So first starting with the MyChart messages, what happens is that every week that a patient doesn't see a provider, the iSpy CRC sends a MyChart message to the patient. And this is what the MyChart message looks like. So over the past week, have any of the following symptoms caused you new and or significant discomfort or concern? Listing all of those symptoms, and then patients will respond with, yes, the symptom is bothering me, or no, the symptom is not bothering me. The patient's response is then forwarded to the triage nurses, and then the triage nurses ask follow-up questions about the symptoms. After that, the I-SPY patient answers the questions, and then the triage nurse provides advice or escalates the question to the nurse practitioner or med-onc. It's a 6-step process, quite tedious as you can see. The way that these MyChart messages are then sent back to the providers is through adverse event tables that are compiled by I-SPY CRCs. So what information do we need in the trial and in the clinic in general? We calculate clinical grades using the Common Terminology Criteria for Adverse Events, or the CTCAE. It's a universal clinical grading system that allows us to understand the severity, frequency, and interference of a patient's symptoms. So you can see for diarrhea, the difference between grade 1 and grade 2 is the frequency of diarrhea. The difference between grade 2 and grade 3 for diarrhea is the interference on a patient's life, so limiting instrumental activities of daily living. For nausea, we can see that the difference between grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 is the severity of the nausea. So severity, frequency, and interference are pivotal in understanding a patient's symptoms. So like I said, these symptoms are compiled into this adverse event table. This is an example one from a patient of mine. And the I-SPY CRC collects these adverse events by looking through the entire medical record. So that's the med-onc notes, the NP notes, the nurse notes, and the patient responses to MyChart messages. Because it's a lot of work, it's really hard to do all of this in real time. So the adverse events are retroactively compiled into a table and sent via DocuSign for the provider signature. Because it's done for data purposes and not in real time, providers are unable to use information in the clinic currently. And the last way that patients report their symptoms is through ePro surveys, which you will quickly see is the key to this problem. So what are ePros? ePros stands for Electronically Based Patient-Reported Outcome Surveys. This is a quality of life questionnaire that is sent weekly to all I-SPY patients, and it's a joint effort by I-SPY researchers and patient advocates to further I-SPY's goal of maximizing patient quality of life. So similar to the Common Terminology Criteria for Adverse Events, the ePro survey also assesses severity, frequency, and interference in a patient-friendly way. So symptoms are scaled on a scale of 1 being none, or 5 being very severe, very frequent, or very interfering. And you can see 3 examples of those questions up to the right. So this is the many problems at hand. Patients report the same symptoms to I-SPY CRCs, triage nurses, med-oncs, NPs, and via ePros at different time points every week. It is obviously a redundant and exhausting process for them, and they just aren't being heard. Adverse event collection for research purposes is a multi-step process that is tedious, inefficient, and time inaccurate because these adverse events are collected retroactively. And finally, clinic symptom management currently fails to leverage information that is already collected earlier in the week via the ePro survey. So the question I sought to answer is, how can we optimize adverse event data collection for both clinical and research purposes? And the solution is ePros. So ePros already collect valuable information about patient symptoms. How can we package these responses to inform both the clinical and research teams? I'd like to start with a scenario. So in this scenario, a patient has filled out her ePros survey, and the I-SPY CRC see the following ePros scores. So the patient reports diarrhea severity of 2, diarrhea frequency of 4, and interference of 2, nausea severity of 5, frequency of 2, and interference of 1, and finally, constipation severity of 0, frequency of 1, and interference of 0. So we can see that the patient through this is experiencing more diarrhea and nausea, but her constipation is controlled. So now the CRC will follow up with the patient about these responses. So the I-SPY CRC would send a MyChart message asking clarifying questions only for the uncontrolled symptoms. So as a reminder, this was the initial MyChart message. It's asking about all of these questions. But now that we have the results of the ePro survey, we know that the symptoms that we need to identify or talk more about are diarrhea and nausea. So once the patient responds to these questions only, their responses are sent back to the triage nurses, and the triage nurses can go straight into giving advice and symptom management instead of asking the patient more follow-up questions all over again. So in this sense, ePros has jump-started a conversation into the clinic. So based on the patient's responses, she said that she has 5 loose stools a day and her nausea has not affected her food intake. So the diarrhea grade would be 2 and the nausea grade is 1. 24 hours before the patient's appointment, the I-SPY CRC would send the oncologist a list of symptoms that the patient is actively experiencing. The physician can then plan to adjust care and recommend symptom management in advance of the patient's appointment. And then during the appointment, the oncologist can more effectively address the patient's symptoms because of this information that is already known. And finally, after the appointment, the oncologist can sign off on the patient's symptoms in real time and correct grading as necessary. So the ePro survey is now jump-starting an effective conversation in the clinic. So this is the before, as we've already seen, and this is the after. So the I-SPY patient responds via ePros, the CRC triages the answers, coordinates accordingly, and then sends those responses to the medical oncologist, nurse practitioner, and the triage nurses. So this workflow really does benefit every single party involved. The first, for the triage nurses, because the patient is answering more specific questions about their symptoms, the triage nurses again can jump straight into faster advice. Regarding the patients are only reporting symptoms once a week and they're only answering the relevant follow-up questions as necessary. So their prior responses are being heard. For the med-oncs and the NPs, they can be informed about symptoms before seeing the patient and again can plan care accordingly. For ePros and on the research side in general, patients have more incentive to complete their surveys because responses are now integrated into their clinical care, again allowing us to collect valuable information about patient experience in one trial. And finally, for the I-SPY CRC, adverse event collection will be easier because the CRCs only have to look at these ePros and patient responses, time accurate and then consistent across all sites because this is a process that can be operationalized. So what's next is piloting this workflow at UCSF, eventually expanding it to other sites and adjusting the ePro survey to include all of the questions, even the ones that we include in the MyChart message, just to make sure that we can make this process even more efficient. And that is all. And these are my acknowledgements. I'm Rita Basu, Mia Jones, Laura Esterman, Anne Marie, and all the BCC interns.
Kim, we want to thank you for this work. I mean, well, Rita and I are trying to figure out how we're going to get our survey responses up to 95, 99%. We actually had no idea that the CRCs were asking their own surveys. And so this process that you went through, how to organize care, that would come under re-engineering, right? And so that's what, all the people doing OneSource and all the people in the clinic, but this is exactly what we're looking for all of you to do. If you see something that doesn't make sense, or the process is really screwed up, you can't complain about it, but don't complain about something if you're not going to take the time to look into it, figure it out, and come up with a solution. When patients call and complain, that's an opportunity to intervene and do something better. Amber, you had a question.
Yeah, I think just the other piece of it that, you were kind enough not to mention, Cammie, is that it does make us look somewhat incompetent from a patient standpoint if they have given this information and it's not being, their assumption is when they tell someone, anyone, that information is going somewhere, in particular to their provider. And if it's not, then when they get there, they're surprised that their oncologist has not received this message. And that's a failure on our part to communicate.
Nothing is more annoying than to a patient than answering a survey with every case of attention to. And let me tell you, that's about 90% of what happens.
Right, and the optics of that from the patient's perspective are that we're not all on the same page, which means that maybe we're missing something that's going to adversely affect them. So their trust level goes up a lot when everybody seems to know what's going on. So I love this.
Yes.
And the one thing that the physicians and the nurses are going to integrate is what's the one thing that's not making progress?
Lab values.
Lab value. It just so happens, right, Amrita? I see here's the list of things that we should put in there that we might have to ask. Amrita and I just wrote this little NCI supplement about trying to automate the lab values, predict all the PROs just with lab values plus 5 questions or whatever you might actually make that. But now, actually, I saw a few more on that. Send Amrita and I the presentation, just so we can add that to the grant today.
Yeah.
Anyway, oh, look who's here. Our instructor extraordinaire. Oh, Timberlake. Oh, Wallace, I should say. Actually, Hope is the first person that I hired at the breast care center. Actually, I have to say, I didn't actually hire her at the beginning. She actually volunteered for me for 6 months until I had some money so I could hire her. But thanks to the Crowlicks, actually, because you sat next to them at a baseball game. You just graduated from Duke and said that you were looking for something. Yep. Chris and Jeff called me up and I said, okay, that's actually how it's done. Anne Marie was shortly behind me. and Hope does presentation training, helps people get their PowerPoints together. It's a fantastic job. Okay, fantastic. Okay. All right, next up is Mina.
Hi everyone, my name is Mina, and before I start, I just want to say the lesson I learned this year was that never be afraid to reach out to your mentors or even people you've never talked to before if you need help or if you're just having trouble working on something. The worst they can say is no, and then you can just continue working at it with like your peers or the BCC internship program. So yes, I will be presenting today on assessing tolerability using the FACT-2B5 instrument in the I-SPY trial. So what is the FACT-2B5? It stands for the Functional Assessment of Cancer Therapy, item GP5, which stands for general population. And the 5 is because patients are able to say whether they were bothered by side effects of treatment, and they rank that on a 5-point Likert scale from 0, not at all, to 4, which is very much. And this is administered to breast cancer patients in the I-SPY clinical trial on a weekly basis, along with the EPRO's quality of life assessment, which can be just talked about. And unlike other surveys assessing for anxiety, fear of recurrence, and distress that are also distributed to patient, although not as a part of the EPROs, the FACT-2B5 is very well completed, so it can serve as a robust and valid measure of patient-reported bother as a side effect of cancer therapy. So the objectives, I wanted to use the FACT-2B5 to assess drug tolerability and also to visualize symptoms and tolerability. The study population is, again, the I-SPY2 patient population, and I particularly looked at those patients who filled out the FACT-2B5 and also the patients that filled out the EPROs of that population. So first, I took a look at some summary statistics, in particular cumulative FACT-2B5 statistics. So in this chart here, you have the cumulative max score, the cumulative mean score, and the cumulative median score over the course of the I-SPY clinical trial. And so you can see here that the cumulative mean and median scores pretty much match up well. So if we're using the cumulative mean score as a sort of summary metric, then we can see that on average, patients are a little bit bothered by side effects of treatment, as cumulatively their score sort of reaches 1 and then hovers around 1 for the duration of the trial. So I wanted to sort of use the cumulative mean as a metric to visualize the FACT-2B5 in particular for the patient and how they relate to the rest of the patient population as well as to the rest of the people on their arm. So this is just an example plot. If you have a sample patient in green, you can see that compared to the average patient on the clinical trial, which is in dark blue, they have a higher FACT-2B5 score over the course of the study treatment cycle, and then their score sort of decreases towards the middle or by the middle of the AC cycle, and then they fare a little better compared to the average patient. But if you were to say, like, how do they compare to the average patient on the same arm that they're in, then you can see that they tend to fare better and that they have a lower FACT-2B5 score. So after looking at that using the cumulative mean as a metric, I wanted to see if the FACT-2B5 score changes from the baseline. And so on the bottom chart, you have just the number of surveys that were completed, so we can make sense of like the ends and what the score means at each different time point. And so we can see that the change in score in the first couple of weeks sort of increases, and then throughout the rest of the treatment cycle, it started to stay the same. But then during the AC cycle, it jumps and there's a higher change in score, it goes, the change in score is more than 1.5, and then that gradually wanes again by the end of the follow-up period. So after that, I wanted to say, okay, so we know at certain time points, we do have at least a bigger increase in FACT-TP5 score. At certain points, we have a high FACT-TP5 score. So are there any symptoms associated with a high FACT-TP5 score? So what I did, I took 33 of the symptoms that were reported on ePROS, and I looked at the patients who had those symptoms and compared their scores, their FACT-TP5 scores, to the patients who didn't have those symptoms. And I wanted to see if there were any significant differences between the two populations. So I found that nausea, headache, constipation, decreased appetite, and dry mouth were symptoms that were associated with the high FACT-TP5 score. And you can see that at which particular time points that they were significant. So it tends to be studied treatment cycles 3 through 8. And I just took a particular look at 2 of the symptoms. So I took a look at the change in nausea as compared to the screening time point through the rest of the trial time points. And I saw that, again, in the first couple of weeks, you have this increase in the score of nausea. And it pretty much, the change pretty much remains the same throughout the rest of the treatment cycle. But then it jumps by the middle of the AC cycle, you have a change in nausea score by 1.5 points. And then that decreases by the time that the patient has surgery. And for headache, it's kind of similar trend. You have an increase in score during the first couple of weeks of treatment. That kind of decreases by interregimen. The AC cycle, the change in score is only about half of what it was in the first couple of weeks of treatment. And just a side note, you might see that follow-up 3, it seems to have like a big increase in the score of headache. But I do want to note that the number of patients that filled out surveys is very small, especially if you compare to, let's study treatment cycle 2 is over 150 patients responding, but follow-up 3, you only have less than 20. I think the number was like 17. So the takeaways that I got from this project was that the FACT-TP5 survey allows you to temporally assess tolerability, and this was actually one of the original future steps that the original people who wrote the paper, Pyramid et al. In 2018 wanted to do, and that symptom analysis can be useful for active symptom monitoring during the trial. And the next steps would be to design a way to efficiently return these tolerability results to physicians and patients in an easy-to-read manner, and to continue using the FACT-TP5 to find a combined endpoint of efficacy and tolerability. Great. Yeah, I want to thank, of course, the BCC Internship Program, Laura Esterman for starting the program and for giving us all this opportunity. I really want to thank Amrita. She was immensely helpful. She really guided me throughout this project, and she taught me what meaningful data analysis really looks like in the real world. And I really am continuing to learn from her. And I think about the stuff she says a lot when I'm doing data analysis. And I also wanted to thank Somia, who is a former BCC intern. She now works at Quantum. And of course, Anne-Marie, my fellow intern. Shout out to the iSpy interns in particular, and to Mia for just refreshing me on my base of the iSpy clinical trial and for ePro surveys collection. Thank you. Great.
Amrita, do you want to make a comment since you were the mentor for these last couple of presentations? Are you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this has been so exciting to finally we have enough data to be able to analyze this data, incorporate it hopefully into the workflow soon, into the clinic workflow as Cami described. And now we're doing this amazing work on trying to combine tolerability with efficacy. And that's really the vision that we have. And we're really moving towards achieving that. So this was, really, these projects have just been, I think, so fruitful in enabling us to visualize this data, which was really the first step.
Do you think your confidence in GP5 is a reflection of how people are doing? That's going to be, yeah, looks like the groups are pretty much the same. And probably, you think about something with headache, you have certain things sometimes over time, people get better at management, so it's a reflection. If you have it in the beginning, you learn how to manage it, it should get better, but, you know, I think especially when that GP5, you see that big jump in the patient's RNA-seq. Being able, that's one of the things too, to meaningfully show to patients, once they have confidence. And again, part of the confidence comes from their physicians. When physicians are confident, you know, we did this because there's a bunch of clinical trials that showed, you know, once you've gotten a PCR, additional chemotherapy doesn't help you. But when you're used to giving a set amount of therapy, it's hard to stop doing that. And so one of the things that frightens patients is, well, maybe I should just do it. But then when you look at those symptoms, it's not just that you have worse symptoms, it's like a whole nother 6 months to a year of recovery. And you know, I think that as people do well, you need to get to like 2 or 3 years for the whatever we're calling yes, but I gotta come up with better names. See, remind me of what we said it was. Anyway, you know, when we get that, I'll tell you, I think patients are more excited about it than physicians. You know, and even in the first year, 25% of people successfully stop early and did just fine. That's just the beginning. And you know, we have people going in I-SPY to the OR after block A alone. That's, you know, especially, you know, bispecific antibody that doesn't even have a toxin on the first patient with the response. That, my friends, is the illness. And these visualization of symptoms, being able to get people to believe we can do something different. Again, just from the beginning, you gotta imagine it, and you can work to make it happen. And everything that everybody's doing is a part of that. You have to generate the data to show why we should stop. Not that you shouldn't be able to figure that out on your own, but sometimes people are just afraid to change. Anyway, thank you so much. Fantastic job. Chats. Yeah, as Jessica says, congratulations on getting that done with all your other responsibilities. Fantastic. Okay. Next up, we have Eleni, who's going to talk about the stromal landscape.
Hi everyone, my name is Elene, and important lesson I learned this year is that medicine is both art and science, and that is well captured when we think of personalized medicine. That means targeting treatment to patients' biology, but also to their preferences, priorities, and values. And the science aspect of medicine is focus of my talk today, which I did by exploring the stromal microenvironment of breast cancer in I-SPY trial. Over the past few decades, we have learned that tumor is not just composed of cancer cells, but also numerous other cell types. This is known as tumor microenvironment that influences cancer growth and metastasis. And therefore, in order to come up with targeted approaches to breast care, we need to not only understand breast cancer cells, but also their surroundings. An important and highly diverse component of tumor microenvironment is stroma, that consists of cell types such as fibroblasts and endothelial cells. And I was really interested in further exploring the role that stroma played in breast cancer. To address high complexity of stroma in my investigation, I used previously developed 14 stromal cell signatures. And each signature is a set of genes that allows us to reliably identify a stromal cell by looking at gene expression data. For example, mesenchymal stem cells can be described by genes listed here, and by looking at their expression, we can calculate gene set enrichment score that can be then used as a proxy for identifying presence of stromal populations in both tissue. I specifically focus on calculating these stromal signatures within the I-SPY trial, which you heard a lot about, but just to quickly highlight a few points. Before patients undergo treatment in I-SPY, gene expression data of their tumor is collected, and then response to therapy is assessed at surgery by looking at pathological complete response, which is complete disappearance of tumor, previously existing tumor. And PCR has been shown to be a good indicator of long-term survival. pathological complete response, or PCR, has been shown to be a good indicator of long-term survival. Which is why one of the goals of I-SPY is to identify biomarkers that are associated with PCR and allow us to personalize treatment. Indeed, I-SPY has recently made use of these biomarkers, including immune biomarkers, to come up with a reclassification schema that includes response predictive subtypes listed here. And these subtypes have been shown to better capture tumor biology and also increase PCR rates compared to traditionally known receptor subtypes that rely on hormone receptor and HER2 status. So my goal was to contribute to this mission that I-SPY has toward biomarker development by looking at stromal signatures across breast cancer subtypes and also assessing how they're correlated with response to therapy. So I first look at stromal signatures across HR/HER2 status. So here each panel represents a different stromal cell signature, and on y-axis you can see stromal signature scores across 4 different HR/HER2 subtypes. And what we observed by looking at these graphs is an interesting trend, which is that for signatures highlighted in boxes, triple negative subtype displayed here in red had the lowest stromal score. And that was also the case when we looked at calculated overall stromal score combining all 14 signatures with triple negative subtype exhibiting the lowest stromal score. So this conveyed to us that stromal composition is distinct across breast cancer subtypes, and we wanted to see if that's also the case for recently developed response predictive subtypes that I just told you about. So we looked at stromal signatures across these subtypes as well, and found that this subtype called HR negative immune positive displayed the lowest stromal score for signatures highlighted in boxes. And that was not surprising because as you can see, a lot of triple negative cases fit into HER2 negative immune positive RPS subtype. And indeed, when we also looked at again, the overall stromal score across the subtypes, we found that immune enriched subtype had the lowest stromal score. And that conveyed to us that maybe there is some relationship between immune and stromal landscapes. That led us to further explore this by examining correlation between immune and stromal signatures based on hierarchical clustering. So this heat map here displays the correlation between those signatures, with red indicating positive correlation and blue indicating negative correlation. And you can identify immune signatures by looking at these horizontal and vertical lines, specifically at green and orange, and stromal signatures by looking at light purple. And so if we here with a black box, what we can see is that a lot of immune signatures are negatively correlated with stromal signatures. And this suggested to us that maybe increased stromal presence prevents immune infiltration within the tumor. So as I told you before, one of the goals of I-SPY is to find biomarkers that are correlated with PCR. So we also looked at that for our stromal signatures, and then found that for 9 out of 14 signatures that were significantly different between PCR and no PCR groups, patients who achieved PCR had significantly lower stromal signatures than patients who did not. And that was also observed in the overall stromal score, with lower stromal score being correlated with PCR. In contrast to higher immune score being correlated with PCR from previous findings. So that again points to this negative relationship between immune and stromal landscapes. So in conclusion, we investigated one of the most comprehensive sets of published stromal signatures. Our analysis indicates that stromal composition is different across breast cancer subtypes, as well as I-SPY 2 response predictive subtypes. And triple negative subtype and HER2 negative immune positive RPA subtype exhibited the lowest score for many stromal signatures. We also observed negative correlation between stromal and immune signatures, suggesting a role for the stroma in decreased immune infiltration. And our results indicate that reduced presence of stromal cells is associated with PCR. We hope that additional exploration of the stromal microenvironment may increase specificity of response predictive subtyping to further personalize treatment to a patient's tumor biology. With that, I would like to thank my mentors, starting with Dr. Rosalind Sayaman, who is incredible scientist and human being. She really taught me so many technical, creative, and critical skills I needed to succeed in this project by holding weekly voluntary art workshops for many of us. I also would like to thank Dr. Laura Mampir and Dr. Laura Esserman for their world-class expertise that becomes an everyday reality for us BCC interns, but it is, in retrospect, quite a privilege to have that opportunity. And also to Diane Habitsian, who is amazing patient advocate here at BCC and provided invaluable patient perspective for this project. Special thanks to Rosalind's Gene Expression Group, Silver, Kylie, Jiyon, and Anna, my mentors Alison Stover-Fustolini and Jeff Lagora and Laura Hubbard, my amazing supervisor Anna Marie, and intern class of 2022-2023.
Fun to see that analysis and be here a little bit more in parallel from Rachel as we are learning, these very high risk DCIS, trying to understand, why does something stay as DCIS instead of going on, and what in these immune subtypes, what makes things work, and again, is it still part of the tumor, or is that just a different class, just something different to not have interest because of the strong, or is it just a different type of tumor? Do you know that?
I think it's a semantics kind of question sometimes what people call tumor, right? Because I think tumor microenvironment is a better way to describe tumor and stroma and immune cells and extracellular matrix and all the other molecules that are in that environment. So I would consider it part of
The
kind of
tumor type.
cancer definitely happening and progressing, but whether we call it tumor or not, I think it's more of a semantic.
Can you envision a future where some of the treatments will involve targeting the stroma?
Absolutely, yeah. If we have a very stroma-rich tumor and we want immunotherapy to work, or we want our immune system to attack it, can we break stroma down by some targeted measures so that immune cells can better reach and do their job within the tumor?
And again, it could be the stroma or it could be the tumor type.
Yeah,
Right.
I think they're both
But-
working and co-regulating each other.
Fantastic. All right, let's just look at the chat, see if there's anything else going on. Okay, fantastic. All right. We are going to keep going. Now, we have the 15 innings in the, so we're going to take the 5th inning stretch before we move to lobular cancer. So everyone
Yes.
at home, and because I have to do it myself, stand up and stretch. You guys can do jumping jacks. I'll just say jumping jacks. Stretch. Twisting. So invigorated and ready to go. All right, in the meantime, all right, so let's go on next. Now we're gonna go to another, we're gonna focus on, now we're gonna focus next on lobular cancer. Again, the reason that we call these things, oh, shoot. Let me forget, Sarah. Handing out books, where's Sarah? I'm right here. Come get your books. Okay. Cammy. I'm right here. Okay. And Nina.
Laura, why don't you explain to the viewers what
Oh
we're
yeah,
doing?
so every year, in the beginning and we're doing At the beginning of the end of the year, we always hand out a book. And this year, our book, we hand out a book, and then during the year, we have a book club. The old turns, we'll invite them on Zoom if they're not here, but we have something, we've had lots of fun books that we did one on during the pandemic. We looked at polio, an American Story, and this year we have a book called Passionate Minds. It's actually an amazing story about Emily de Châtelet and Voltaire and the Age of Enlightenment. And Voltaire is known to have been the principal translator of Newton's works from Latin to English and French. And I find it very amusing because I was a history of science major, and I've written a paper about this, gone to the Rare Books Library at Harvard, looked through all this, and it's like, wow, this is so amazing. And it missed the fact completely that the reason he did it was that he had a mistress who was a brilliant mathematician. Of course, women couldn't really do that. So a lot of the work was done by a brilliant woman who wasn't allowed to be recognized. But this is why we know that women need a seat at the table and at the head of the table. All right, but anyway, it is a fantastic story, and it is actually a true story that he and because she was married to a wealthy nobleman, and they created sort of like the equivalent of the NIH to do all these experiments. Anyway, it's a lot about the times that need to be changed, just like our current times need to be changed. So stir everybody to make sure they go to the ballot box. Okay. With all that, we're going to move now to lobular cancer, another opportunity to focus and personalize. Right?
Hi everyone, my name is Firdaus, and something I learned this year is to always ask questions, and a lot of them. My project this year was evaluating surveillance strategies for lobular breast cancer, which I worked on with my mentor, Dr. Rita Mukhtar, and the Lobular Research Group. So to start with some background on invasive lobular carcinoma, it is the second most common subtype of breast cancer behind invasive ductal carcinoma, and it is most commonly hormone receptor positive and HER2 negative. Its main characteristic is the lack of the adhesion molecule E-cadherin. E-cadherin typically allows ductal carcinoma cells to stick together in these duct-like patterns we see in the first image, which are the round structures. Because ILC lacks this protein, these cells arrange themselves instead in single file diffuse pattern, which we can see in the second image. This molecular characteristic of the cancer has important implications in how it is diagnosed, and this causes ILC to not always form palpable lumps, thereby going undetected on physical exams. It also causes ILC to not appear on routine imaging studies like mammograms, which we can see an example of here. Generally, ILC is more difficult to detect through traditional screening and surveillance methods. ILC's unique characteristics also have implications on its rate of recurrence, which begins as lower than invasive ductal cancer in the first 5 years since diagnosis, but becomes higher over time, which we can see in this comparison of rates of disease-free survival of the two forms of cancer, in which ILC has worse outcomes after the 10-year mark. Now, an important aspect in improving outcomes related to breast cancer recurrence is consistent surveillance of breast cancer patients after primary treatment in order to detect any recurrences early. As per the American Society of Clinical Oncology guidelines, surveillance should include a physical exam every 3 to 6 months for the first 3 years, every 6 to 12 months after the first 3 years, and then annually after the first 5 years with a mammogram every 6 to 12 months. Based on the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines, surveillance should include an annual physical exam and medical history for 5 years, and a mammogram every 12 months unless the patient had a mastectomy. At UCSF specifically, our surveillance guidelines are also based on the type of surgery the patient received. So for lumpectomies patients, they receive a mammogram every 6 months as follow-up, and some patients also receive an annual MRI. Mastectomy patients instead receive a physical exam every 6 to 12 months. Now it's important to mention that all the guidelines we've covered do not consider the differences between distinct breast cancer subtypes and use traditional surveillance strategies that are thought to be less effective for ILC. Because of this, our research project asked, what is the best surveillance strategy for patients treated for lobular breast cancer? We looked at this question based on the type of surgery the patient received for their primary cancer, and we've differentiated the strategies for local and distant recurrences with the ultimate goal of evaluating the efficacy of current surveillance side guidelines for ILC patients specifically. Our project used the ILC Outcomes Database, which is a database containing information on all 910 patients diagnosed for and treated for ILC at UCSF between the years of 1997 and 2022. We evaluated all patients who had a local or distant recurrence after being treated at UCSF and determined how recurrences were detected for these patients. The variables we collected included their date of recurrence, site of recurrence, surveillance strategy used in their care, and the method of discovery for the recurrence. To define the discovery methods for local recurrences, this included routine mammograms and MRIs, physical exams by clinicians, being palpated by the patient themselves, or discomfort by the patient via other symptoms, and tumor marker tests. For distant recurrences, discovery methods included routine breast imaging, imaging indicated by the appearance of a local recurrence, symptoms potentially related to metastases, incidental findings, and again, tumor marker tests. So our overall findings were that 117 patients experienced a total of 137 recurrence events, with 58 local recurrence events and 79 distant recurrence events. There was an overlap of 20 patients who experienced both a local and a distant recurrence event. For local recurrences, 40% of patients who received a lumpectomy found the recurrence by palpating mass themselves, while 23% discovered through routine mammography and 16% discovered through routine MRI. Mastectomy patient overwhelmingly discovered their recurrences through palpation, with 32% palpated by the patients themselves, and an additional 25% palpated by the clinician. To zoom in on some of the most interesting pieces of the local recurrence data, the 5 patients who detected their recurrences through other physical symptoms included nipple inversion, skin sensitivity, pain and swelling, numbness, and weakness. Out of the 13 lumpectomy patients that presented with palpable masses, only 7 were receiving routine MRI as part of their surveillance, and only one had a routine MRI and 7 had routine mammograms. Out of a total of 28 patients that received mammograms after discovering their local recurrence, to evaluate the extent of disease, 32% had a false negative mammogram. 6 of these 9 patients had discovered their mass through palpation, 2 through routine MRI, and 1 on an incidental PET scan. For the distant recurrence patients, a great majority of cases were discovered through the appearance of symptoms that indicated the need for a PET scan. But about 10% of lumpectomy patients and 20% of mastectomy patients also discovered their distant recurrence due to imaging they received after being diagnosed with local recurrence. To describe more about the symptoms that were indicative of a distant recurrence, this included regional pain related to an area of metastasis, cough, shortness of breath, weakness, neurological function, and palpable abnormalities. To summarize this data, amongst the patients that received a lumpectomy or mastectomy, the most common method of detecting a local recurrence was a patient palpated lump. But not all of these patients were receiving regular mammograms, and very few were receiving MRIs. For the distant recurrences, the most common presentation was patient-reported symptoms. The conclusions that we drew from this project for local recurrences suggest that routine surveillance imaging may have low utility for identifying local recurrences after treatment for patients with ILC. For distant recurrences, the data suggests that imaging is only indicated if a patient is already reporting symptoms. But a major limitation of this project, though, was there was a lack of uniform mammogram and breast MRI use amongst the basic population, both as a surveillance tool and as follow-up care once their local recurrences were diagnosed. So that limits our ability to draw conclusions about these imaging modalities. This was also a retrospective study, meaning that we may have introduced bias while piecing together chart data to make a call about how a recurrence was discovered. Our next steps related to this recurrence data is to determine the diagnostic yield amongst patients who had an MRI or mammogram specifically, to better understand if these imaging modalities are effective in diagnosing a recurrence. And we'd like to evaluate the impact of a given surveillance modality on the timing of recurrence and overall survival rates. I'd like to give a huge shout out to Dr. Rita Mukhtar for being an incredible mentor to learn from this year and helping us with this project. Also to the data collection team, Al, Mandy, Helena, Harriet, and Astrid recently, and the whole Lobby of the Breast Cancer Research Group, which has been amazing to be a part of this year. Thank you.
Recurrences, do you know about how soon they get the first 5 years, the second 5 years?
So I think on that slide there, I did calculate your time to recurrence. So for local recurrences, it was an average of 6.6 years, and distant recurrences was 5.7 years.
So for these slow growing or hormone positive tumors that are most likely to occur after 5 years, so we have a one size fits all guideline where we're looking upfront early. Is that what they all do with hormone positive?
No, that's as well. Yeah.
And it's actually still not that common. Local recurrence is not that common, so it's hard to justify doing an MRI on everybody, right?
Right.
Is that, and then everything is biopsy. That would make Susan great. And, yeah, so we wouldn't want that. So I think that's, again, having people be aware of their own bodies. How, from the talk that preceded yours, you would think the stroma is what? What's stroma? Single file. Ask Melanie and her coming after me. Think about the stroma. This is, you said, that we can get more infiltrates, immune infiltrates, but the stroma is less. But a characteristic of globular cancer is what? This is why I say this, there's more to this story.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand it, but it's pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
And so it would be really cool, because we've got the data. Tell Rita about it, because we could we'll just do that same analysis in the library. Maybe we can do it the next couple of hours. Or get Rosalind to do it, because it is really interesting. I think that you may not have the stroma, but I can tell you already, I just happen to know globular cancers, so I don't know, there's something like, where are they and why, what else, what's, that's what I'm saying, like what, the immune system, immune system, it's annoying. Can't quite figure it out, but there's something else that's right. All right, let me look at the chat, see if there's anything else. We're good? Oh, fantastic. Okay.
I have a question. Are there more genetic mutations associated with ILC?
Well, yeah, probably not, but there is one genetic mutation that is more common. And
Yeah, ecatorin.
well,
Most.
but also CDH1.
Yeah, CDH1 is ecatorin, right? Yeah,
It is.
that's the gene. Yeah, encoding for it.
So, okay, while we're on the topic of ovular breast cancer, Somi, go ahead and tell us what you found.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie. I'm going to start off with one important thing that I learned this year, which is that just because something is done a certain way for a long time, it doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it or the right way to do it. So there's always something more that we can learn.
And that's the truth.
And speaking of my research project this year, I worked with Christina Yao and Rita Mukhtar in the validation of RCB in lobular breast cancer after neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So that was a bit of a mouthful, so I wanted to start out with a background. First, just defining RCB, which stands for residual cancer burden. So RCB is a numerical score that's calculated after a patient completes neoadjuvant chemotherapy and surgery. So from the surgical specimen, a pathologist will look at 5 different factors of the tumor, things like tumor dimensions and the cellularity of the tumor and a couple more you can see on the slide, to come up with a numerical continuous score. From there are predefined cut points that can help categorize patients based on that score into 4 different classes. So a score of 0 corresponds to an RCB class 0, which, as Eleni mentioned, was pathological complete response, no tumor left at surgery. And then increasing score from there corresponds to RCB class 1, 2, and 3. So why is this important? Why do we calculate RCB? Well, in previous studies, we validated RCB as a predictor of the number of years a person lives without a recurrence of cancer, which is also known as event-free survival. So the idea is that we have an individual score for each patient that we can use to accurately estimate their risk moving forward after surgery. The catch here, though, is that it's been validated in breast cancer in general as this prognostic measure, as well as certain subtypes of breast cancer. But RCB has not been validated in lobular cancer specifically, which brings us to our research question, which was, is RCB an effective prognostic measure for event-free survival in lobular cases? To answer this question, we used a data set with over 5,000 patients. 216 of them were characterized as lobular cases, while the rest were characterized as non-lobular. And we had information about RCB status, clinical pathological data, and follow-up data that we used. So I wanted to start off with just a quick overview or comparison of our two groups, so our lobular groups and our lobular group and our non-lobular group. Compared to the non-lobular patients, lobular patients were a little bit older, had fewer RCB zeros, and were mostly grade 2, so over half were grade 2 compared to mostly grade 3 in the non-lobular cancers, and also had a much higher percentage of HR positive, HER2 negative cancers, so about 74% were in this subtype. Then we compared the prognostic value of RCB in both of these groups using some of these methods listed on the slide. So we started off by using mixed effects Cox models to plot, RCB score versus the hazard rate for event-free survival events. So hazard refers to a person's risk, and a higher hazard usually means a lower event-free survival. So for the non-lobular population, with the graph on the left, you can see this really linear relationship between the RCB score and hazard. So as RCB increases, hazard also increases. And this is also reflected in the plot on the right, where we plot event-free survival with time. And this is separated out by RCB class. So you can see the blue line is RCB 0, the red is RCB 1, green is 2, and yellow is 3. And they're very clearly separated from each other, right? So that shows that, this y-axis is the percentage of people who have not had a recurrence. So yes, and then here is time, over time. So you can see as these curves go down, that shows the number of people who are still, who haven't had a recurrence with their cancer. So because each of these curves are separated by RCB, we can tell that the RCB class is a really good indicator of where a person will fall on this curve in terms of their event survival. So it's prognostic. Now, it's a little bit different with lobular patients. So you can see with the curve on the left, it's a curve, it's no longer a line, we have a non-linear relationship. So the hazard rate only increases with RCB score after a certain point. And for the lower RCB scores down here, we don't really have that much information on that patient's hazard ratio. So moving to this curve on this plot on the right, this is also reflected here in that these first three RCB classes, so 0, 1, and 2, are super overlapped. So we can't really tell a difference in their event-free survival. And only RCB3 tells us that those patients have a lower EFS rate. So what we did next was we looked at the statistical significance of RCB in terms of a worse survival rate. And we actually found that RCB was statistically significant in both groups, even when we adjusted for variables like age, T category, node positivity, and grade. So after all that analysis, our conclusion was that RCB is significantly prognostic for EFS in lobular cancer, but within this population, the lower RCB scores are not as informative. So our question morphed a little bit, and then we asked, can we improve the prognostic ability of RCB for lobular patients specifically? And the answer here was yes. So we used recursive partitioning to identify 3 different biological factors that identified groups of patients that were the most separated out by event-free survival. So those 3 factors were overall cancer cellularity, the number of positive lymph nodes, and the tumor size. So, for example, this group A, the purple group, had a high cancer cellularity, whereas this group here, the blue one, C, had low cancer cellularity, low number of positive lymph nodes, and a larger tumor size. And I just wanted to compare this new graph that we got. So this is the same one from the last slide where we, after we did the recursive partitioning. And this graph is the same one that you saw before, which uses RCB class. And so you can see that the curves on the left are a lot more separated by event-free survival than the RCB classes, which means that we have a much better idea of which patients are of the risk of the different patient groups here. Also, it's a little bit hard to see on the slide, but I wanted to point out that this high surviving group, so this lower risk group, consists of 98 patients out of 216, which is a pretty big proportion of the patients that are having this really high survival rate. And we can pull that out with this grouping compared to this one. So in conclusion, we found that RCB does have prognostic value for patients with ILC, but that relationship between RCB and EFS may be a little bit different in globular patients specifically. Also, cellularity, the number of positive lymph nodes, and this was surprising, a larger tumor size are strong indicators of responsiveness to chemotherapy in this population. And in terms of next steps, I'd love to validate these results on a different data set in the future. And then I'd also just like to say thank you to my incredible mentors for guiding me through this research project. Also to Dr. Esterman, Anne Marie, everyone else here at the BCC, and then also all of the people who have participated in the clinical trials that contributed to the data that we used.
Okay, great. So, who we kicked out of ICE now you know that. There was no, what's one of the criteria? What sends people up to the
And they have lower risk.
molecular because it doesn't actually remember. This is doesn't mean that they have to get those ER positives first. Being ER positive is long tail of curves. Once we solve all the people in eyesight, we still have all the other patients who that the reason we're hoping doing endocrine optimization pilot is because we don't actually have the cancer. So one thing Rita did, like I mentioned to you, that she was a research resident. Anyway, was we looked in globular cancers in I-SPY, that was in I-SPY 1, to try to figure out, once, if you threw out the low molecular weight versus high, in the data set you got, I can't look at that, but you could look at grade 3. But the grade 3 people have that same risk. It's very interesting that they're, again, the earlier the recurrence, the easier it is to tell. Let's go back to that recurrence rate. What is this? This is 5 years. So interesting. But so here you were asked about tumor size.
It's the last.
And it may or may not be response to chemotherapy. But what you're saying is you've got, this is higher cellular, this is lower cellularity, low positive nodes,
and larger tumor size.
So what would you say about a large tumor that has big nodes?
Well, since it also has lower cellularity, I would say that it's or maybe that's the way that it shrinks it.
There's a really interesting thing. This is actually what got me onto the whole idea of ultra-low risk. Some of these ideas that I saw this in ovarian cancer, it was a big tumor. It didn't involve the nodes. They got a lot. That is a cancer that has far less risk than a small cancer that's multiple positive nodes.
It's your body's
to that area. That's right. And so if you look at SEER and you look at large tumor size no nodes, those people that is a far better thing to have than a small tumor that's rapidly metastasized. right? Small to big nodes. So it's an interesting thing. Again, what's containing it? Is that the stroma? Well, it's a different kind of stroma, so we don't know. That's the good thing. Never stop learning. Now just look at it's kind of interesting answer. So RCB, we should actually take this, because most lobular cancers, 75%, 80% of the lobular cancers are low risk or low risk, pretty much, maybe 15, 20%. So this classification might actually work. You might want to ask Joe to look at the, before EOP, there was the I-SPY2 low risk registry, right? We have two medications in there. Yeah, for the whole thing, it's like 200. Yeah. We look at that because those people will have a good budget. There's the difference. How long do you do? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a there. I mean, because it may not just apply to lobby. It may apply to, you know, who are here positive for triggered. And I think the thing you have to ask yourself, those people need chemotherapy who have big tumors. That's just that. Good question, but that could be something again with development. Good thing we have now is the time to have fun at the BCC with all this data. What can be better than that? All right, any questions in the chat? Okay, fantastic.
Congratulations.
Okay, so we are moving right on to the next question of trying to understand who's got what kind of cancer and, moving into the idea of screening and whether or not we should be personalizing screening as well. Catherine's gonna, I'm sure, tell us this answer.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm a second-year intern. And the two biggest things I learned, I will recycle my first one from last year's perfection is the enemy of the good. And also that it's important to continually advocate for yourself and the issues that you care about and not be afraid to do that. So my presentation today is outlining the work that we've done in the Wisdom study to capture environmental risk factors among the Wisdom cohort through geocoding. So as we know, across the United States and the world, there's environmental exposures that emanate from human processes. Manufacturing, traffic pollution, toxic disasters, and more serve to put chemicals out into the atmosphere, into our water, into the food that we eat. And we know that these toxic exposures increase cancer risk and often are most burdened in under-resourced communities. So one of the major aims of the Wisdom study, which is a nationally recruiting breast cancer screening study, analyzing the efficacy of personalized breast cancer screening, is to assess participants' risk to better understand how we can detect those who are at high risk for developing breast cancer. And hopefully, through improving our risk calculations, we can enable us to provide high-risk consultations, risk-reducing medications, and more intensive breast cancer screening for those who need it most. So the way in which we currently calculate risk in Wisdom is primarily through two ways. One is through genomic profiling, which analyzing a 9-gene panel and several SNPs using the polygenic risk score, and then also through the breast cancer surveillance consortium model, which inputs 5 risk factors, including one's age, one's biopsy history, one's race, ethnicity, one's breast density, and their family history of breast cancer. So through the polygenic risk score and the BCSC model, women are stratified into higher and lower risk groups, and then are offered screening recommendations accordingly. And while those risk models are somewhat comprehensive and do serve to predict a lot of women who are at high risk, The model of breast cancer causation likely looks a bit more like this. The graphic here is from the Breast Cancer Prevention Partners and provides sort of a simulation and overview of the likely multifactorial causes of breast cancer that range from biological, behavioral, social, and physical in our physical environment, and how they all are intertwined and relate. And this observation, understanding that our risk calculations are good, but they're not as comprehensive as they could be potentially, sort of served as the impetus for this project. So our research questions in this project are twofold. One, how can we better understand the environmental exposure burden and socioeconomic diversity within the wisdom cohort? And then how can we use this data to better understand how neighborhood exposures contribute to breast cancer risk? And hopefully further down the line, we can use this information that we've learned to better improve our breast cancer risk calculations, specifically for those disadvantaged populations who likely have an elevated breast cancer risk that is not currently being inputted currently into the risk calculations that we use. So the way in which we did this is through a process called geocoding. And so what we did is we took each wisdom participant's address at study entry and assigned this address to several different geographical spatial units, including census tracts, zip code tabulation areas, and the county in which one lives. And then once we had that data, we mapped this information to 3 different indicators. One is the area deprivation index, which quantifies deprivation among a given geographic place. Another is the rural urban or RUCA code, which quantifies rural urban status. And then the last is the environmental justice screen, which quantifies 12 different environmental variables. So what we found preliminarily among the wisdom cohort is that most of the wisdom participants reside in the 3 least deprived sort of deciles of the area deprivation index, which is not necessarily surprising given sort of the population that we know normally participates in clinical trials, but was a notable finding. Yeah,
It's not an insignificant.
it's not. It's not, and I think Wisdom has done a really, really great job to improve recruitment in places that are more deprived, and so I think this number will continue to improve as we continue to recruit. The second thing that we found is that most women within Wisdom reside in more urban areas, and just as a note for this this indicator, it is not evenly distributed across the 10 indicators, and more people in the US live in urban areas. So we would expect to see this skew anyways towards more urban areas. However, this is also important to note that most people within the Wisdom cohort are living in more urban areas. Yes, exactly. And I will just note too that there is pretty considerable variability across these indicators among our different recruitment sites. And so I think that's also important to think about, especially as we're directing recruitment efforts moving forward. And then lastly, this is the environmental justice screen. I mentioned it a bit ago, but basically this is the data set put out by the Environmental Protections Agency, and it quantifies 12 different environmental indicators listed here. I won't go into all of them, but it is a pretty comprehensive look at environmental exposures ranging from air toxins to like toxic waste exposures through hazardous waste facilities, et cetera, and even water pollution as well. So this slide, this is still preliminary, but this shows the distribution of Wisdom participants across these 12 different environmental indicators that I mentioned on the previous slide. We can see that largely Wisdom participants fall around the national average in terms of exposure to these different environmental toxins, but we can see that there is an elevated exposure to PM 2.5 and hazardous waste sites, but a relatively lower exposure to Superfund sites and underground storage tanks. But we're still like looking at this data and trying to understand it better.
And probably should be targeting recruitment.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's what's really cool that we can do to sort of target these areas more targetedly. So then quickly, we do also see among the wisdom cohort that among Black and African American populations, they are more likely to be in the most deprived areas. So which is reflected in literature as well. But I think again, just serves to to emphasize the point of increasing diversity within the wisdom study, which will also increase our socioeconomic diversity as well. And then lastly, we see that area deprivation is associated with higher environmental exposures. Again, this is reflected in literature as well, but we also see it within the wisdom cohort. So our next steps within wisdom, this is really exciting. This project is hopefully gonna continue on. We're planning to capture participants' residential histories, which will help us better quantify exposure over time, knowing that breast cancer has a long latency period, and it's important to understand. Likely, it might be more important to know where someone was born or where someone went through puberty versus where they were living when they were diagnosed. And we also hope to capture one's occupational history because we know that toxic exposures can happen in the workplace. And then hopefully we'll use all of this data to hopefully integrate into new risk models and new risk inputs to better quantify this. I will also note that I was lucky to attend 2 conferences this year, one of which was just held in New Orleans actually. And I think this geocoding work is actually being used across cancer surveillance. It's a pretty new field, but it's really exciting that I think a lot of people are starting to use this. And while I was at the conference, spoke to a lot of people who were excited to form a geocoding working group. So we're hoping to do that sort of across institutions. And then also SEER, which is a nationally sort of cancer registry that a lot of people use to do sort of more population-based research, plans to map environmental exposures to residential histories they have of people who are diagnosed. So hopefully we can continue to use these methods on a more national level as well. And then I'll just end by saying, I think all of this is critically important to understand how environment influences risk, but I also think there is data that shows this already, and I think it's up to all of us to continue to advocate to improve the living conditions that we all live in, especially in those more deprived areas, because that's, I think, going to be critical to our overarching goal of reducing cancer incidence and mortality. And then I'll just end by acknowledging all these wonderful people on this slide. Dr. Kimberly Vidal, I've been so lucky to sort of work with in tandem to sort of get this project off the ground, and I'm so grateful for her mentorship. Allison, Laura Vampier, and Laura Serman have been such wonderful mentors to me. And then Anne-Marie, we could not do it without you. So thank you for all your support. And then the UCSS STIGS Core has been critical in helping us out. And of course, all you lovely BCC interns. It's been a wonderful 2 years, and I'm very grateful. So thank you.
I mean, obviously, you know, everyone's been trying to look for the smoking gun in breast cancer, what environmental exposure is really going to be it. Hasn't been found. But again, that might be because they're looking how exposures have what other piece of data might we have to this that might be sort of what we don't have. You mean what's like for guess we already calculated. Yeah, but what's specific? What's genetics? And yeah. You know, it may be that if you're in that, you know, that you can have, you know, a bunch of polygenic risk that's high, and that may not matter. Yeah, I think for sure looking for variation polygenic risk, and it may be, as I was telling Kim, you know, the attempt, you know, Michael out there was the head of environmental safety practice to us. I didn't know the legislature, and people gave good resource for you guys. Anyway, keep in touch with those people, but yeah, we tried to say many years ago environmental conferences, we think that, once we measure the SNPs, the ability to point a finger, voters, that they better, it's coming, and better watch out, because we're gonna be able to prove, once we have SNPs, that all the food is hurting people. So, that was about 15 years ago, and here you are, so there you go. But it does, but I think it's super important, and I think the other thing is, who is the most interested in this issue of exposures?
Oh, that's such a, and that's something I meant to note, wisdom participants consistently talk about their own environmental exposures and how they feel like that influences their breast cancer risk. And so it's a really, really good
They are
point I mentioned.
super interested. So when you say, are you willing to fill out an extra, but we don't want to do it, but I'll bet you'll get 90% participation. If you say, look, we're trying to get at this, if you tell us, if you answer these extra questions, get your.
We can better understand.
Yeah, you can get the, wisdom to think about that, but I will bet you, you'll get about 90% participation, especially the people in the VA, the people who serve in the military, people always call me asking.
Right, yeah, and veterans certainly do have higher rates. Absolutely.
So,
I think your point too, though, about how this could influence people differently, I think there was a lot of the conference that talked about that, how for some populations, we see that environment has a much larger impact than others, and so it's not simple for sure.
Right, we know that smoking is really, a huge risk factor, but, some people smoke every day for 90 years and never get cancer, and some people smoke for 5 years and they get cancer. So there's obviously some interaction. I think the other thing that probably was huge is microbiome, your food exposure. We're just at the beginning of that. We'll get there. But for sure, we know, right? So it influences your response to immunotherapy hugely. So it's there. But we've never been able to figure out the food thing either. But that's because there's been but that's science is coming for that too. So all those things. So super interesting. And the answer to should we be screening everyone the same is no. Okay, fantastic. All right. Anything online?
Just congratulations.
Great. Get all this figured out in the next year. All right. Rachel, it's about time for your presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel, and I would like to start by saying the most important thing I've learned during my time as a clinical research coordinator in the BCC internship has been that the beauty of clinical research really lies in offering patients a choice. And even when investigational treatments fail or don't have the most desired effect, patients have still been overwhelmingly grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the future of treatments and just to have someone who cares about giving them a choice. So today I'll be talking about something that many of the presenters have already touched on, which is the importance of screening and differentiating between different subtypes of disease. As screening has increased and become more personalized, we've become able to identify more cases of ductal carcinoma in situ, an early stage breast cancer that generally is harmless until it travels beyond the confines of the duct. So some patients have a higher risk of developing invasive cancer, and these are the patients we want to target with our investigational treatment that we're exploring in an ongoing clinical trial. And so this treatment, yeah, thank you. So this is what a tissue slide of DCIS looks like after we apply a technique called multi-phycilidal cells. And you can see in yellow there is tumor cells surrounded by B cells and T cells in pink, almost as if they are trying to contain the tumor. And if you look really closely, you can see a sort of margin around the periphery of the tumor cells, which we call a moat, because like the moat of the castle, it almost looks like it's preventing the immune cells from infiltrating and attacking the tumor. So our therapy consists of two components that work synergistically to overcome this moat and to activate and expand the immune cells in the vicinity of the tumor to contain and maybe even reverse the experience. This is just a slide about how the mRNA works to activate different immune cells, interleukins, cytokines, and vicinity of the tumor. So the two major questions I'd like to address today are first, what is the potential of our new immunotherapy to produce clinically significant responses in these patients without having them proceed to surgery? And two, are there components of the immune microenvironment of PCIS that can predict the response to immunotherapy? So we've investigated these questions through a pilot study of 10 patients so far. Each patient has received either 2 or 4 doses of a combination of PD-1 inhibitor and mRNA. And in every patient, we've taken a pre- and post-treatment biopsy and MRI. And so far, we've seen 4 partial responses out of 10 and 4 complete responses out of 10 patients. We've also evaluated clinical characteristics in this cohort and found that the majority of patients who are responding so far are HER2 positive. So we think that this might be associated with response. This MRI is the crowning jewel of our trial so far. In the left, you can see an area of enhancement circled in red, which represents the patient's tumor. And on our image on the right, just 6 weeks later, after two injections with this therapy, the patient's tumor has completely dissolved, which was also confirmed by a complete pathological response in her tissue. So this naturally leads us to ask why some patients are having this beautiful response, whereas others aren't quite responding as much or not at all. And the current reigning hypothesis, although we still have much to learn, is that the patients with tissue that looks like the tissue on the left here, with a lot of pre-existing immune infiltrate and activation, are able to benefit from the therapy, as if it's tipping the scales in favor of the immune system against the PCIS. Whereas patients without this existing immune regulation and infiltrate, they just can't quite, the immunotherapy just isn't quite enough to this. So our ideal scenario in the future is to be able to take a patient's blood sample and take their biopsy, and based on the immune characteristics present, to predict whether this patient will respond. And by identifying which patients will respond, we can really boost the efficacy of this treatment and benefit as many as possible. So far, our analyses of have included calculating the percentages of different cell types present around the tumor. And we're specifically interested in the immune infiltrate present and how this varies between non-responders and responders. So these graphs are supporting our hypothesis that I mentioned earlier, that responders have a higher amount of T cells and B cells present in the tumor environment prior to treatment. On the x-axis, you can see the patients divided into non-response, partial response, and complete response. And on the y-axis, you can see the percentage of immune cells. Our next step will be to analyze the proximity of different cell types to each other to further distinguish different types of patients' immune characteristics prior to treatment. And we'll do this using a nearest neighbors analysis to calculate proximity scores. An example of a relevant conclusion is that if a patient has higher proximity score for tumor cells
and cytotoxic T cells. This is associated with better outcomes. So our next steps include looking at zooming in on the cell types that we've already started looking at: T cells, B cells, macrophages, PD-1 positive cells, to further distinguish between responders and non-responders. And we'll be able to do this with a technique called spatial transcriptomics. We'll look at different blood assays, including CyTOF, RNA sequencing, and markers in peripheral blood. And we're excited about a new home collection blood kit called the potassium kit, which will allow us to evaluate patients' systemic immune response for 24 hours following injection and prior to injection to see what's changing and further the mechanism of this treatment. And our second objective is to assess what is the most effective cocktail to treat DCIS. And this includes adjusting the dose and attempting to use mRNA monotherapy alone in the absence of a PD-1 inhibitor to see where the effect is really. So in conclusion, our preliminary results suggest that intralesional immunotherapy can result in significant clinical responses, and that manipulating the immune microenvironment in DCIS may actually be an effective strategy to alter or even reduce the progression. Prevention really could be a future option for high-risk DCIS patients. And I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful mentors, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Esserman, Kirby over there, and of course all of the women who have participated. And my wonderful supervisor, Anne-Marie.
And wait, I have a question for you. All right.
Yeah, this is.
That's it? Okay. So one more thing, thinking about Elena's presentation, going over the fence project. Let's, again, there's like 85% of DCIS are these small positive ones that don't really have the cells at all. Then there's these big DCIS. Somehow, you gotta ask, why are they just DCIS? Why are they not? That person who completely responded had a little bit, that little circle in there was a basis against it. We had to get an exception from the NRB to let us get away with rejecting it. Like shut, it's like when you see that go away, you're like, my mentor was Ron Levy, he's like the father of like the first patient they treated, we were working. I was actually in the lab at the time. We took the monoclonal antibodies that we were making in the lab. Wasn't from the company. We just took and gave it to him. He went from like on death's door the next week to completely fine. And as Ron used to say, he spent the next 10 years trying to figure out what went right. And I have never forgotten that. I called him the day after this, after the first response and after this one, and trying to figure out, like, if it works, why doesn't it work for everybody? That's why we all have a job, right? Because it's not easy. It's easy, someone else would. So what other things from the defense are we also looking at? Don't give it to me like that.
That's from the defense.
Yeah, so thinking about element.
Oh, I know we're thinking about the stroma, as well as the.
Yeah, I think that stroma is different. I think it may also be, that it looks like it's important because we're already pulling out high risk. Not your, I spies shows molecular activations. So it's the same thing for our right? Yeah, there is at least, there is something about, and someone's already published this, but you know, there's this layer of cells around the duct. Is that called glial cells? And so those myoepithelial cells, you would think if they're nice and tight, that would keep the tumor from getting out. But in fact, the looser they are, the better. I think we're gonna look, I think, you know, that'll be the next part of it. But we'll look for that because it's counterintuitive, but of course, if cells can't get out, what can't get in? So, you know, will that be the missing key? So it's very, so. Very exciting. Mike, do you have any comment? Campbell?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, just great job, Rachel. And I agree, there's still, oh, my dog's here. There's still a lot we need to understand about what's going on, and especially the partial responders who, even though they do have higher infiltrates, they're still not completely responding. So I think there's still a lot to learn here.
Yeah, sadly, it's not quite ready for the prime time, but close.
Close.
A lot closer than we were before.
Yep.
You can see how many projects, this tells you how long, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's a 6 intern project.
There's a question from Jill in the chat.
Jill.
Hey there, Rachel. Great job. You know, I mean, obviously we're great to see these few women with, you know, complete responses. I'm just curious, you know, do you have a sense of, do you think we'll have to keep treating them at all to keep anything at bay, or, you know, do we have these completely gone away? What do you suspect?
These women with partial responses do still generally need to proceed to surgery. But we do have a hope that maybe the treatment could be contributing to prevention of future recurrence, but we really just don't know.
Oh, of the complete responders, we have 3 complete responders. Did they go to the OR?
Right,
Did they go to the OR?
No.
They did not. Because you gotta understand, even though we wrote the protocol, that we were only doing for people who were gonna go to the OR, right? But who's the type of person who wants to participate in this trial?
Really forward thinking that we want to avoid the standard of care.
I don't want the surgery. So, you know, that's one of the things you learn. That's when you change. I had changed the protocol, right? Because the people who want to participate, it's like, I wasn't anticipating we'd have a complete response, you know, but, you know, once you have a complete response, you know, I really tried to talk the person into going to the OR. I said, well, please let me take out the place that was a face of cancer. She said, but then you're gonna leave all the other stuff behind. So how does that make sense? Right. I said, okay, well, we're gonna biopsy that, but if that's got anything in it, then we're gonna, but there was nothing in it. She goes, well, I don't see any reason for me to go to the OR. And it's like, that is irrefutable logic, right? And so, but those people, and so far, no one's come back. That's actually just so extraordinary. It's too bad we didn't have the blood spot thing. Good job on the blood spot, figuring that out, where it says. All right, fantastic. All right. Stretch. Okay. Now we've got new local. We're going to talk now. We're going to turn to local tools, and some of our local therapies besides surgery. We'll talk about how that's changed. Kat.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kat. The most important thing I learned at the BCC this year is that time is flexible and that there is time to do more than we think there is. So today I'm going to talk about MRI and breast radiation with the hope that better using technology can mean less radiation, and less radiation can mean better toxicity profiles for our patients. I'll start with some background. So as we've discussed today, the modalities typically involved in cancer treatment include surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy. Similar to surgery, Similar to surgery, radiation therapy is a local regional treatment where we're trying to kill cancer cells before they leave a local area. In the context of breast cancer, radiation is most often associated with lumpectomy or breast conserving surgery, which you can see on the screen on the left. A lumpectomy is when the surgeon removes a partial bit of tissue where the tumor was and leaves behind healthy breast tissue. Lumpectomy and radiation has the same long-term outcomes as mastectomy, or the removal of all breast tissue. In the context of breast radiation, there are two main kinds of external beam radiation. There's partial breast irradiation, which you can see on the top row, and there's whole breast irradiation, which you can see on the bottom row. From these images, you might be able to see that with partial breast, the row on the top, the treatment area is smaller, and with whole breast irradiation, the treatment area is larger. It's also important to note that partial breast is delivered over 5 days with a higher dose per fraction or a higher dose per day, as compared with 30 days, where a smaller dose is delivered per day over a longer period of time. From the Florence trial, which was a major trial evaluating accelerated partial breast irradiation, partial breast, and comparing it to whole breast irradiation, showed that whole breast and partial breast irradiation are equivalent in terms of overall survival, which you can see on the right, for early stage cancer patients. And this is a really exciting evidence base to motivate treatment de-escalation, a theme we've been discussing all day today. From a patient point of view, acute and late treatment toxicity and cosmesis outcomes are significantly in favor of partial breast. So when the overall survival is similar, we get to deliver better toxicity profiles for patients, which is really exciting. So in order to deliver accelerated partial breast, we have to have a way to visualize the treatment area, and we do that through a process of simulation. This is particularly important for partial breast. So if we go back one slide. So currently there are 2 phases of radiation treatment that we'll discuss. In the planning phase, we use imaging to visualize the treatment area in a process called simulation. On this next slide, we can see that CT is the standard of care for patient simulation in the planning of radiation treatment. While CT creates high contrast images in areas of high electron density, so in areas that are contrasting between bone and soft tissue, for example, it is less effective in more homogeneous regions such as the breast. So this challenge in tumor bed delineation has created an unmet need for improved imaging to help guide breast radiation therapy. In this slide, we can see that I'm trying to show that MRI has superior soft tissue delineation as compared to CT. And that's really interesting to us in breast radiation therapy because of the capacity to better visualize tumor cavities and to help more people receive de-escalated partial breast radiation. So this fall, Dr. Singer and I, along with a 4th-year medical student, performed a retrospective study to evaluate MRI simulation in radiation planning in the setting of lumpectomy cavities that were poorly defined on CT. On this next slide, we can see these images that show the results of our work, where the arrows point to tumor volume, while the circles delineate regions that are indistinguishable from cavity on CT, but distinguishable as non-tumor volume on MRI, which means that with the use of MRI, we're able to shrink the treatment area. So this study showed that MR enhanced tumor cavity visualization and treatment planning in a majority of cases, but more work is needed to understand the clinical implications of this change. So this year, we hope to do exactly that. SAFI will begin to prospectively enroll patients on MIRROR, a protocol where patients will receive MRI simulation in addition to CT simulation in treatment position. So trying to take a step back, beyond these direct applications and the potential of MRI to increase the number of patients able to de-escalate treatment, we might wonder whether there is any need for CT at all. Right now, getting an MR sim is an additional acquisition time rather than CT alone, but could be moved to a treatment pathway that is MR alone eliminating CT would have MRI take the place of CT. Eliminating CT would require MRI to take the place of CT. But right now, CT is very important because it holds electron density information, which is critical to estimate dose. So in order to eliminate CT, we must have a different way to derive dose information. So to explore this treatment pathway, a physics resident in radiation oncology, Kamal Singh Rao, and I conducted a retrospective trial in head and neck patients here at UCSF. On the left of the screen, you can see the CT simulation, which, similar to breast cancer, is standard of care in radiation planning. On the right side of the screen, you can see the MRI simulation along with the synthetic CT, which is derived from the MRI, which is meant to take the place of traditional CT. In our study, we found that while there were differences in the CT versus the SCT, synthetic CT images, these differences did not correspond to a change in clinical acceptability of plans that use one versus the other to create a treatment plan, providing some exciting starting points for how an MRI-only pathway might be developed for treatment. Go to the next slide. So in conclusion, we know that MRI improves visualization of soft tissue tumors, and we have additional questions about the clinical relevance of this finding. And that's what motivates this study called MIRROR, which we'll see start enrolling this year with SAFI. In MIRROR, we're hoping to answer questions such as, does improved visualization really increase our capacity to de-escalate treatments? And does it improve the toxicity profile for patients? I would like to thank Dr. Lisa Singer, my mentor for this project and one of my mentors for this year, along with the radiation oncology team, which includes this set of people, along with Dr. Prionis and Dr. Park in the breast radiation group. I'd like to thank Anne-Marie as our supervisor and Dr. Esterman for holding the vision for this project, for this internship, and giving us space to imagine the future of medicine. And I'd like to thank my broader mentor team, which includes Dr. Marissa Piper, Nisha Parmeshwar, Dr. Alvarado, and Dr. Mokhtar. So thank you so much.
For the MIRROR studies, one thing that would be really helpful is MRI, again, is not perfect, that's how it should. What happens when you biopsy catheter? Why don't use it to get over so you establish that. Plus more stuff that can't truly there. So it is, so that can be scary. So one thing that might be really interesting is correlation of looking at what the cavities are by MR versus who knows best what the cavities are. So correlating with the surgeon, trying to figure out how big the cavities they left, what they did. And that's a very procedure, I think, is probably maybe for those patients out here. Should try and insist that trying to get the surgeons to go to the OR and make sure we use a really very procedure. I don't know how much artifact it will cost, but I will put money on it. The actual cavities are small, especially with people close to them. But again,
How do you go smaller than?
than what the MR's gonna estimate. But it is really interesting. There's this huge debate in radiation therapy and local therapy. On one side, that there is the de-escalation of the type of treatment, and then there's the whole question of who needs it in the first place. So like, and it's one thing to do de-escalation, and it's another thing to decide, oh yeah, I'm just gonna take 40% of the patients, they don't need it. Most people aren't good with that. But you know, I think it's one of the things actually to keep in mind that we should think about various criteria to think about this good quote. Like if you really want to be targeted, how aggressive. It's again, it's an interesting way to one way instead of having people do things up, is it is really interesting. One of the recent controversies came out was the target, the intraoperative radiation tool. Astro, the American Society of Radiation Oncologists, did not put that in their guidance. Is there evidence to support that? What level of?
So there was a randomized control trial with target A, but what it was comparing with was older radiation techniques. So there isn't evidence at this point.
Well, there is evidence. There's evidence that it works just as well, right? And when you wake up, does it even, they maybe you're only 5 treatments for that, but how many do you need after not, you don't go because you didn't heal, right? Which is still much more convenient. But the fact that they didn't put it in their guidelines, what does that reflect? It's a much lower reimbursement. Hard to imagine that. Nobody likes, most people don't like to put themselves out of a job. I myself, I've got plenty of jobs, so I'd be happy to get rid of this one job. So, there's a question, but these are just interesting things to think about. Everybody, you know, one of the things as interns, you know, you are, when you are talking to patients, you are their advocate. This year, when you are part of the whole medical machinery, you are part of the whole medical machinery. And to remember that every specialist has self-interest. Right? That's just fact. And you have to guard against that. I mean, it's so insidious, you can't help it. Everyone have to work hard not to be an advocate for your specialty. Remember, you're not a terminally differentiated stem cell that you go into a building because you have what? You have a brain. All right.
There's one question in the chat.
Yes. Okay, from Dr. Pianist, Nicholas. Go ahead.
I'll try to read it out. My question was about preoperative radiation. It's not the topic of your study, Kat, but your study is fantastic. But because MRI contrast of soft tissue, you know, imaging contrast is best before you do surgery, and you have a whole bunch of soft tissue changes and seroma and all this leakage and different issues. Do you have any thoughts about using MRI to guide radiation before surgery?
Is that a question for me, Dr. Pianist?
What would you?
Yeah.
You mean using the information on MRI to guide the post-op treatment, or to give the?
Nope, to give the radiation before surgery.
I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think there are some preoperative radiation trials out of MD Anderson right now in the omission of surgery. So that's a really interesting idea. That would be worth exploring. Yeah.
Well, you know, Nicholas, one of the interesting things, you know, we're trying to think about that de-escalation trial in surgery. You know, if we've got the in I-SPY, you know, you can do a sentinel node, just a core biopsy, and then just a partial breast radiation. That's an idea. But or for the smaller tumors, where you know you're going to give radiation, and you could do 5 days of. I mean, how soon would you operate after that? Because you know that is, yeah, that is probably one of the issues. But it's always good to be thinking. Very interesting.
Thank you for your comment.
Great job, Kat. And I just want to agree with Dr. Esterman. We all want to be put out of a job. If we don't need to be used as a treatment, that would be great.
Yeah, we have other things we'd like to do in our life. Okay. Thank you. Fortunately, there's only one person who stands between you and lunch. And one of the things we do to try and personalize care is we really try to pay attention to personal needs of patients. So personalizing, I think, heard that earlier, personalizing to treatment, but also to people's experiences and the anxieties that come. So we're going to have Eliza talk to us about supportive care units.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the lesson that I learned at the BCC in these last 2 years, and it's a little corny, but Dr. Smith, you said this the other day, that cancer teaches us that life is not a dress rehearsal, and that you have to be living actively now, and you need to do what's important to you now. And I've seen that this applies to cancer patients. Of course, I've had many conversations where this has come up, but it also applies to us as interns. And so I encourage you to not live this year or this 2 years waiting for the next metric of success or waiting until you get into med school, but live during this time. So do things that are exciting to you every day. Don't just wait around. Oh, I can't go out and hang out with my friends. I need to work on secondaries, or I can't do this thing. I have to study for the MCAT. Go anyway. Okay. So I've had the pleasure of working on a bunch of projects outside of the Breast Care Center, and this exploration is one of them. And it's actually kind of across the campus. So to start off with a little bit of background, the American College of Surgeons Commission on Cancer has put this mandate on the Cancer Center stating that we must evaluate patients' distress. And then depending on how distressed the patient is, someone from their oncology team needs to contact the patient and identify what is causing that distress and then how we can address it. So to meet this mandate, a group of psycho-oncologists and social workers at the Cancer Center designed a survey and a workflow to do so. And we actually really had to change things during COVID, but it has brought together 3 different projects of mine in one place. So it's just BCC Interns do some casework, and then I also work very closely with the social worker teams and the psycho-oncologists. So excellent. Okay, so how do we actually do it? And it is through this model, which is pretty straightforward. So we send out this survey called DSCNS. We determine who is meeting certain predetermined clinical thresholds, and then conduct what we call a second layer of assessment. So that's when we're talking to the patient about what your concerns are from the survey and how we can give you relevant resources. And then all of this has to be documented in Apex. So we can go back to the larger picture. And this is what the survey actually looks like. So you can see on the left, that's the patient view, completely unreadable. So I have written it on the right. And basically, there are 4 main components. So this first thing at the top is called the distress thermometer. And it's just a Likert scale. So from 0 to 10, how would you best describe how much distress you've been experiencing in the last week? Then the next part you can see underneath is actually a custom needs assessment. So this was made in tandem with social workers to figure out what areas are patients most often coming to you or going to a supportive care service. And then let's put that in here so we can know automatically when they complete it, what they may want help with. Then this is actually 2 different components sort of mashed into one. So this is something called the PROMIS Anxiety and Depression Scale, and I think we use that in pros and in a bunch of different surveys. Yeah, it's like a constant, but it's basically the same in the past time spent 7 days. How do you feel fearful? It's hard to focus. How do you feel worthless, helpless, depressed, hopeless? And you're answering again with the Likert scale. Okay. So this is just the actual structure from a really high level of how we evaluate these survey responses. So if a person's response is not telling me that they're either moderate or severe, we're saying that's awesome, and they send an automatic letter to the patient, and then they can follow up with anyone that they need to. But if we determine that they are distressed in 2 different capacities, then we do a detailed assessment. Next slide. So this is the mild. Again, those are the actual threshold numbers. Everyone, this is Josh. He advises me on this project. Next slide. And then this is what happens with a moderate or a severe patient. So if they're moderate, then one of Jeff's BCC interns calls out to them. And if they are severe, then either a social worker or a psycho-oncologist will call them. So great, it's awesome. Now we have, we go back. So it's great to see this is how we actually send the survey, this is how we do follow-up, but what are we seeing from the data that the survey gives us? And before I answer that, I want to talk about who gets the survey. So right now, we're sending it out to patients across the Cancer Center in solid tumor clinics that don't already have a distress survey in operation. So it goes out to patients in urology, oncology, GI, head and neck, and neuro-onc. It doesn't go to patients in the breast care center, because we already have a way of doing that. And it also goes to patients in EMT, so we're getting blood transfusions for their cancer. And we've been sending it out since 2017, but then in this last year, in October, we decided we were going to add in a new survivors. Okay, slide. So why did we start sending this survey to survivors? So this is because I had an exciting opportunity to combine two of my projects. So I already work in survivorship wellness as the coordinator for that program. And we were sending a survey to those patients before they started, survivorship wellness. And we realized that survey was really long, patients weren't often completing it, and so we could actually just send them the SCNS and get the information that we wanted. So we started sending it to survivors. Next slide. So now we can look at some of the actual data, and I've broken it out by each of the metrics. I'm going to go quick through these. So the actual question, again, it's that Likert scale. What we see is across all survey responses, it skews low. So people are not really as distressed as you would think, but there is a pretty significant p-value there. That could be due to a couple different factors, like hugely different sample sizes, but there is a difference between the two groups of active treatment patients and survivors, showing us that survivors are actually more distressed. And then when we're looking just at the moderate group, there isn't as much of a difference, so kind of those two things dissipate. The next slide, we can look at the same theme is true in anxiety and depression, less so in depression, but there are differences across all responses. When we look at just that moderate band, they kind of disappear, and that's just based on how we define moderate. So what areas are patients actually looking for help? So this is, again, that needs assessment, so you can see how many different ways patients can say, I need assistance. Some of that falls specifically into the realm of social work, like I'm having issues at work or school, I need child or elder care, transportation to and from appointments. But then it's also things like, I don't know how to get around at UCSF, or I don't know what my health information means. And then things like I'm having pain or physical symptoms, I'm fatigued, all these different issues can come up, I think they do come up. And so when we look at the two different groups on the next slide, we can see that actually the top 5 issues are the same for both groups. So whether you're in active treatment or you have entered survivorship, those issues persist. And again, you can see there's a huge difference in how many people are responding to the survey. Part of that is because we've only been sending it in survivorship for a smaller amount of time. But it's really interesting to see that these are not different between these two groups. Just because you have entered survivorship doesn't mean that like, poof, all the issues that I had with my cancer are gone, now I feel amazing. No, I still have quite a few issues and I really need help addressing them. So what are we already doing to address some of these needs? For patients in active treatment, we know that there are a lot of these resources, and patients, when they start at least the breast care center, get a little booklet showing them all the different ways that they can get help, whether it's with social work, nutritional services, financial assistance, or it can be at the patient and family cancer support center. And for survivors, it's a little unclear how they get some of those resources. A big portion of it comes from Survivorship Wellness, which is an 8-week educational program for survivors. They come to us every week. It's like almost like group therapy, but they're learning about one of those areas that they need help in a group setting. They also have the same things available to them like the OSHA Center, they have nutritional services, and they have the patient and family cancer support center. So we're doing some of those things to fill the gaps right now, but it's really hard to know as a survivor, is that applicable to me, is it not? And so Survivorship Wellness is actually a pretty revolutionary program that only exists at UCSF. Next slide, please. But Survivorship Wellness, that is specifically a UCSF. So what can we do better? Oh, sorry. Oops. So we often think of cancer as something strictly biological that you can treat and hopefully cure. We don't really think sometimes about all the other components that matter in someone's care. For patients in active treatment, we need to be looking at the whole picture at every point, not just at the beginning, but throughout their treatment and then once they've reached survivorship. And then for survivors, it's the same. It's critical that we continue to provide patients with support that they need, and we don't just let them go once they've survived without a safety net and without clear steps of what they need to do next. So this could come from something like ecos with Candy. It could be something maybe we put into one source, but there are different ways that maybe something like this can actually be integrated into the physician's workflow and not just being plugged by a group of pre-med interns who are incredibly enthusiastic, but have less knowledge about what.
So one of the things we talked about is the tree. Okay.
No, that's it. That was it. Thank you.
Okay, so towards the end, instead of just collecting data, we sort of talked about the 3 phases of care, right? Preparing for the consultation, delivering particular services during the consultation, and the follow-up. So collecting out. So, ASCO said that you should have to give people you have to do a survivor summary and help collect that. So if you wanted to add something to outcomes, what would you put on that? What would you other than recurrence or complications? What would you say? Like mental health anxiety. So I think one of the hardest things is forward, and most people will say, why do you think people are more distressed when they finish treatment? Just less than clear pattern. You're kind of just like, now because you're focusing on treatment and you were doing something, now all of a sudden and you think you're done with treatment and you're feels great just like that. And what happened? Huge gap. And for people who've had chemo and want chemo, we know that it's about a 2-year recovery. People aren't prepared, and what do their friends and family think? Yeah, you're great. Okay, get back to normal. We don't have to be nice to you anymore. That's it. But it is such a distressing message. I love made this like amazing video. They did it with BCC. They did this to hand that out to people to prepare people for their stuff. That's one of the reasons why we used to have this. You tell people to go out and celebrate they've done. And like mentally think about yourself as getting better, or so do something to celebrate being done. Hear from treatment, so you can eventually break. Or that whole program with Greg Hicks, which we did that sort of by monthly, but I think those are the kinds of things that like to remind people that you still have things to do to feel better. I think this is really important, but being able to document this data is really telling. It's very, if we were actually paid for quality of service, not for things that made us money, doing stuff, but actually taking care of patients. If we could figure out how to pull that off, then we get the resources we need.
Can I make more on that? So my understanding of how this whole thing came about is that the cancer support community and other patient advocacy organizations started really working with the Commission on Cancer to, bring forward these issues of patient experience, survivor experience, to advocate for distress screening. Now, the Commission on Cancer started, I think, in the American College of Surgeons when cancer care was a purely surgical specialty. And back 100 years ago, or whatever, they started, eventually they were accrediting cancer centers. Right. So that is the moral stick that they are using to beat UCSF with, is to say, if you want to remain an accredited cancer center, accredited by the Commission on Cancer, you need to do this distress screening. But this is what's known as an unfunded mandate. Yeah. Because the Commission on Cancer didn't give anybody any money. So, it's an example of how change sometimes comes about in areas, policy changes, where you get a very motivated group of, say, consumer advocates, and they put pressure on an institution that has no desire to otherwise do what the consumers want. And they bring pressure there now. Then the reality is, and this is what Laura referred to in our conference, then the reality is that the institution might try to game the system by doing as little as possible, say, distress screening, because it costs money and it really doesn't make money for anyone.
Well, you have to put in such resources.
Well, and you're really doing it because you're trying to keep your accreditation. So this is the kind of tough reality of institutional politics and
About changing the whole
resources.
frame, right? So this really should be one of the outcomes that everyone will track.
And that's hopefully what we'll get to,
right?
That's hopefully what we'll get to. So I would say that Josh can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a kind of transition in the organization where, like, the organization's eye is on this accreditation, and it recognizes it's the right thing to do, but it can't afford to do it the way we want to see it done. And then hopefully, as we build kind of a snowball effect of like actually seeing what an issue this is for certain people with cancer, and hopefully you start to change business models. Maybe there's more value-based contracting, et cetera, maybe this becomes something that actually gets funded to the extent that it deserves. So that's my, one perspective on this. I don't know, Josh, you have different.
Funding of support services in general is as well because it's not revenue generating. It is
that service.
Yeah, it is in that we prevent small issues from becoming large and we help people reach and receive treatment. So it is revenue protecting, if not generating. But that's really hard to have in a spreadsheet sometimes. To show what would have happened if things had been different. So I think that's part of the struggle is how to have it demonstrated.
I think what's really striking here is the percentage of people who complain of pain as sleep and fatigue. These are fixing problems, and some of this may be post-surgical pain, but it's actually fixing some, probably not really hurt. Some of it's post-chemo pain, but trying to figure out how to have those services or figure that out. I mean, again, if we're switching to knowledge-based care, which I get, but as we think about it, what are making sure that we can do this and provide it, but collecting and showing it is the first step to try and figure out what that is.
One more point, maybe for Safi, is that that uncertainty or lack of information about my health, that used to trigger a direct referral to patient's portal. In fact, patient portal is not on the list of resources that are available. So
It is actually on the letter we sent out.
It is self-reflexive because it is the patient's fault.
But let's actually draw these dots explicitly. And Safi, I'd like you to look into whether we can be better integrated, because it used to be kind of a referral question for that answer.
And it still is, I know we're at lunch, so I don't want to.
Okay. Continuing on our supportive care efforts. Let's see. Actually, of course, when people use cold shocks, then people don't think they've been sick, especially when people right now.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the most important lessons that I learned here at the BCC is to prioritize what matters to patients, whether that be with cold caps and preserving care, or in this case, fertility preservation. So today I'll be talking about expanding access to fertility care utilizing the insurance appeal process. Oh, okay. So to contextualize the importance of this work at the BCC, breast cancer is the most common type of cancer among women 40 years of age or younger, with approximately 12,000 new cases occurring every year in the US. Family planning and fertility concerns affect a majority of these young women and may even affect quality of life measures and treatment decisions and disease outcomes, because some patients may choose to forgo recommended treatments due to the fear or the risk of infertility. Unfortunately, patients are routinely being denied coverage. And this is contrary to the fact that ASCO guidelines were passed in 2006 and at the request of oncologists recommending fertility preservation. So here we can see that healthcare providers should refer patients who express an interest in fertility preservation to reproductive specialists, and to preserve the full range of options, fertility preservation approaches should be discussed as early as possible, and this can ultimately reduce stress and improve quality of life. So in kind of like the greater landscape, as of May 2023, 21 states have passed fertility insurance coverage laws. 14 of those laws include IVF coverage, and 13 states have fertility preservation laws for iatrogenic or medically induced infertility. Next slide, please. Zooming into California specifically, we have the Senate Bill 600 that was passed in 2019. And here it states when a covered treatment may directly or indirectly cause iatrogenic infertility, standard fertility preservation services are a basic healthcare service. An iatrogenic infertility is defined as infertility caused directly or indirectly by surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, or other medical treatment. And it is especially important to note that this legislation does not apply to Medi-Cal, and also any other service plan that's in contract with the State Department of Healthcare Services for the delivery of healthcare. So this is still excluding some people. Next slide, please.
Not some people.
Yeah, a lot of people
Poor.
who need
People who
that.
are poor.
Yeah. So with legislation and guidelines in mind, let's look at the actual process that patients go through when seeking insurance coverage for fertility preservation. So what this looks like is that the patient is first denied coverage or approved coverage. From there, if the patient was denied coverage, the patient prepares an appeal through the independent medical review process, which I will go over in the next slide. And then again, they're either approved or denied coverage. So in California, patients have had the ability to appeal insurance claim denials via the Department of Managed Healthcare, or the DMHC IMR database that existed between 2001 and 2023. And cases were identified through keyword searches, information regarding clinical history, coverage requested, duration of the appeals process, and reviewer information was also identified. And the data here was analyzed in Data SC 17.0. So the results of what this looked like is that we were actually able to identify 133 cases that pertain to fertility care, and 17% of these cases were submitted for cancer-associated fertility preservation coverage. So the vast majority of insurance denials, 91%, were overturned, and this means that they did receive insurance coverage. Cancer patients were also universally successful in obtaining coverage for post-discharge fees, subsequent IVF cycles in the case of for initial outcome, and PGT or pre-implantation genetic testing for cancer-causing mutations. So it's important to note that the denials only occurred in cases where the cancer treatment was not known to cause iatrogenic infertility. Right, okay. And then in California, patients have had the ability, as I discussed earlier, to appeal this via the DMHC independent medical review process. And the purpose of this was essentially to file these fertility-related cases, and it's kind of like an advocacy tool that patients can use to obtain insurance coverage when they were previously denied. It's kind of like a work around the system. So the key takeaways here is that fertility preservation is extremely important to breast cancer patients, as we've seen. However, fertility preservation is only for the wealthy if we aren't offering any insurance coverage, and it's incredibly inaccessible when insurance denies this coverage. However, there are insurance scales processes that exist that can help patients obtain coverage for treatment that is denied in spite of clear medical guidelines. And cancer patients can actually attain this type of coverage. Patients should be counseled on this by both oncologists and fertility doctors so they aren't dissuaded by initial insurance denials. And essentially, we have determined that the independent medical review process is successful and can help patients attain coverage for fertility preservation treatments. But what remains to be done is finding an efficient process to inform patients of their rights and resources and better understand the decision-making factors and barriers to access to coverage for fertility preservation. And as there are currently no regulatory documents and thus no guidance on who exactly qualifies or is covered, future steps are both using the medical decision-making process and then also the prospective IMR filing database. And so this is hoping to actually walk through with the patient how to file that process and then streamlining by basically having like a drafted template of what that letter should look like. And so our ultimate goal is to expand the oncofertility medical decision-making database at UCSF
and determine how to use governmental infrastructure to provide coverage for California and hopefully beyond. So I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to my mentors, Dr. Milani and Dr. Rosen in the reproductive health department, and then also of course Dr. Asselman, Dr. Chen, and Marie, and all their fellow interns.
To get coverage for medical patients?
Yes.
And how are you trying to go about that?
So the process we're trying to do first is by going prospectively and making those insurance appeal letters and trying to walk through and see what's actually successful, because that database is public, but we don't, because so many people don't know it exists, they haven't been using it. So we want to try and use.
I mean, so will Medi-Cal cover it, even though it says they won't cover it?
We're hoping to apply more pressure by having other places cover it. And like showing that it is an actual successful process, but we need the data first, obviously, to.
Well, maybe you can get the hair to state people. They provide $50 for patients. So if you're on Medi-Cal, you should qualify for their discount. So maybe the thing to do is not ask for all of that.
I think it's just obviously the
It seems very
landscape.
unfair. But
Yeah, completely.
however, if you could make a deal with, but that they also probably have some energy. Great, okay, let's see who's on, let's see who's on the chat. Good. Good. Oh, yeah. Did you get it? I will say though, the one thing that I learned early on is that, you know, people may decide that they don't want to do, fertility preservation, but what they really don't want, they don't want that decision.
Exactly, just having the option is super
Super. Okay, and since we know the most important kind of supportive care is shared decision making.
Shared decision.
Yeah, so, yeah, but they might try and go in on a cheaper, like try and put pressure on for both scalp and fertility preservation. You've got a whole group of people who might be healthy.
Kristen. So hi everyone, my name is Kristen Enriquez, and the most important thing I learned this year was that the seemingly impossible can be done through teamwork and communication. So shout out to my teams this year. As Kelsey discussed, it's important to keep in mind what matters most to patients. That might include fertility preservation, and in this case, I'll be talking about hair preservation. So today I will be talking about understanding patient decision-making processes and experiences during scalp cooling on the I-SPY 2 trial under the guidance of Dr. Rugo and with Kelsey. So chemotherapy-induced alopecia or hair loss is a common and distressing side effect of cancer treatment. Scalp cooling or cold caps is a medical device that can help reduce hair loss by cooling the scalp and constricting blood vessels, thereby decreasing the amount of chemotherapy delivered to hair follicles. Cold caps are widely used to prevent hair loss in patients undergoing chemotherapy for early-stage breast cancer. At UCSF, we offer two options for cold caps. The first is Digging Cap, which is an automated scalp cooling system. And option two are Penguin Caps, which is a manual cold capping system. At UCSF, patients with early-stage breast cancer may be eligible for the I-SPY 2 trial, which is something we talked about this morning. On I-SPY 2, we evaluated the toxicity and efficacy of novel agents such as oral paclitaxel and Insequitur, abbreviated here as OPAC plus E, which was a novel oral taxane, and this is a novel way of delivering chemotherapy.
OPAC plus E was administered 3 days in a row. So this meant that for patients using cold caps, this required increased frequency and duration of cold capping. So this project really started with wanting to know how effective were cold caps for UCSF I-SPY2 patients on OPAC plus E. From this first goal, we also wanted to determine the efficacy of cold caps for those who continued onto AC, and we looked at decision-making factors around cold cap usage in I-SPY2. Finally, we also evaluated patient satisfaction with cold caps in I-SPY2. The actual study itself consisted of a post-treatment retrospective survey for eligible patients. These were patients who enrolled on the I-SPY2 trial at UCSF who were consented to treatment on amendments 24 to 27, which included the OPAC plus E arms. And these patients completed at least 12 cycles of neoadjuvant chemotherapy. We contacted these patients through Apex, they consented via DocuSign, and surveys were created in central metrics. From these 56 eligible patients that we identified, 41 patients consented and 36 actually completed the survey. So dividing that into two groups, we identified 20 cold cap users, 17 of which used cold caps for their entire treatment in I-SPY2, and 3 patients used cold caps for a portion of treatment. And this included DigniCap and PenguinCap users. On the bottom, we also identified 16 non-users. Briefly summarizing our study cohort, the median age was in the early 40s, 80.5% of patients were white, and the 4 major breast cancer subtypes were represented, with largest representation from the hormone receptor positive, HER2 negative groups, and triple negative breast cancer groups. Another trend that we noticed was that all patients had some type of technical school or college education, and cold caps users reported having a higher percentage of postgraduate degrees compared to non-users. Also, 63.9% of all patients reported a net household income of at least $100,000 at the time of treatment start. So now looking at the treatment arms these patients were randomized to on I-SPY2, the first 2 rows show the OPAC plus E arms. So this is OPAC plus E with various combinations of carboplatin, monoclonal antibodies, and checkpoint inhibitors. The third row shows taxane-based regimens with novel checkpoint inhibitors and antibodies. And the last row shows just one non-user who was on an anti-HER2 antibody drug conjugate. I also want to note that of the 17 patients who used cold caps for their entire I-SPY treatment, 5 of these patients used cold caps during AC, and 12 of these 17 patients proceeded to surgery or de-escalated after 12 weeks of taxane-based therapy. So we first wanted to ask about decision-making factors. We asked patients on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 is very deterring, 4 is neutral, 7 is very motivating. How did the following factors inform your decision to use or decline cold caps? So here we're plotting the median rating of these factors for both users and non-users. And I'm highlighting privacy of undergoing chemotherapy, hair regrowth or recovery, and doctor recommendation as factors that cold caps users consider to be motivating, whereas non-users consider to be neutral. Hair preservation and body image are factors that cold caps users identified as very motivating, whereas non-users identified as only slightly motivating. And we also identified factors that didn't have too much of a difference between users and non-users, such as financial support and employment/job, which in and of themselves were neutral factors. So here, again, I'm just highlighting privacy of undergoing chemotherapy and doctor recommendation as factors that cold caps users valued as very motivating factors and non-users valued as just neutral factors in the decision. So now we better understand who may decide to use cold caps or decline cold caps. And next, we wanted to look at, for those who did choose to use cold caps, what was your total hair loss from the time you started treatment? So here, we're only looking at the 12 patients who completed 12 weeks of taxane-based regimens on I-SPY and then went to surgery. Of those 12, 11 reported hair loss of less than or equal to 50%, which suggests that cold capping was effective for these I-SPY2 patients on novel taxane-based regimens in I-SPY2. We also asked the same question of the 5 patients who went on to AC, and of those 5 patients, only 1 person reported hair loss of less than or equal to 50%, which suggests that cold capping was less effective for those who went on to AC, but still I think it's worth to note that cold capping helped to reduce total hair loss in 4 of 5 patients. And finally, for those who use cold caps, we asked how satisfied they were with their experience in iSpy 2, asking both Dignity Cap and Penguin Cap users. 7 of 7 Dignity Cap users agreed with the statement, I was satisfied with scalp cooling, and 7 of 8 Penguin Cap users agreed with that statement. So in general, both groups were satisfied with their experiences after they chose to use cold caps. To summarize, so there are differences in the ratings of decision-making factors between users and non-users. An example is privacy and doctor recommendation as factors. Cold capping was effective for patients on novel taxane-based iSpy 2 agents, and a little bit less effective for those who went on to AC. And finally, a majority of both Penguin Cap and Dignity Cap users were satisfied with cold capping. This is important because we're getting to what matters most to patients. And there's evidence that suggests cold capping enhances the quality of life for patients. The decision itself also gives patients agency and a sense of control in treatment-related decisions, and cold capping may lessen the psychological and physical trauma of chemotherapy. The next steps are to identify differences in quality of life measures for users and non-users in iSpy 2 specifically, to increase accessibility of cold capping nationwide, and at UCSF, an exciting new trial called Cooler Heads, led by Dr. Rugo and Kelsey, with a portable FDA-cleared scalp cooling system. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Rugo. Thanks for joining online, and Kelsey for her support, Rita for help with data analysis, Dr. Esserman, and Marie, and everyone here. Yeah, thank you.
What was the rate of hair loss in people with oral who did not use?
It was 100%. All patients who didn't use cold caps
on all of that?
Yes.
Because that's strange, because there was not, at least the national reported use of cold caps was low, and the total hair loss was about 40%. Oh, I think 40%, right? So, and I don't think that many people were using cold caps with that at home. So it's interesting how many people have just
in the whole circle.
I mean, so did we use
16 months.
69 users, 16 for all their hair.
I can double check.
You should double check, because that's not, because the national average is something like 40 to 50% of hair loss, in which case it was 50-50. Can you check it? See, yeah, just trying to think about these kinds of supportive services. It is, trying to figure out total preservation, how total preservation is.
Hope's saying she can't hear you, Laura. Just talk a little loud.
Okay, but I mean, it's so expensive, and this is, but again, that's, well, we don't know what's gonna happen with the objectives, but but I would love to see that. Yeah, go ahead.
Jumping off of Kelsey's, how is full cap reimbursed by insurance?
So technically, insurances say that they cover cold caps, but UCSF specifically hasn't put billing in place. So we can provide our authorization, and instead it has to be like a retroactive reimbursement, which means a lot of people still have to pay up to $3,000 upfront. So it's not quite the
And
same.
I think they only get like 60% back.
Yeah.
I think they get like 1,700 or something, or it's 1,600 right reimbursement. So you just, and then Care to Stay provide up to 1,500.
But even still, Care to Stay is a reimbursement.
They give like a small, like 15-25% discount for Dignity Cap, but I think it's not that.
That's still more. But I mean, that compared with fertility preservation without the insurance, was 40,000.
Yeah.
Yes, that's that. But I do find it. I just in light of all the Supreme Court rulings, I just have to say I find it absolutely extraordinary that everybody is okay with laws that are passed that discriminate against full swaths of people, as if we don't have affirmative action for people who are white and have privilege and have wealth. That's our affirmative action, that's completely accepted. I just find this extraordinary. And I want to encourage everybody, you know, physicians used to be social revolutionaries and social activists. There's so much of this that is unfair. By accident of birth and where you are, it's, you know, X is not the land, free the brave. Anyway, so stand up, as I say, rise up. We'll be doing more of that soon. Okay, fantastic. Okay, Maida, going beyond the binary. Political party.
Yes. So hi everyone, my name is Neva. And I think I actually remember sitting here, this is actually last year, watching the other interest presentations, and I knew right then what I learned this year would be, and I think it's been proven again and again. So what I learned was that I'm less alone than I think I am, even if sometimes I doubt myself. So, and just drawing off of Kristen and Kelsey's talks about, you know, some of these barriers to treatment and care that certain patient populations face, and also Catherine's talk on how we can expand different risk factors, I really wanted to focus on gender diversity as a risk factor for breast cancer screening and understand how we can promote inclusion of gender diversity. So, sorry. So I wanted to start out with a brief description of what breast cancer screening already looks like. And so most recommendations are really just based on these three factors: breast density, age, and census and birth. And we have a little bit of information that suggests how sex hormones might influence risk of breast cancer already. So there's a lot that's uncertain, and it's a lot more complicated than what I've summarized on the slide. But the gist of it, mainly from the Women's Health Initiative, we have a sense that estrogen, specifically estrogen and progestin, increase risk of breast cancer. More recently, testosterone seems to have made to decrease risk of breast cancer, and secondary hormone androgen is a lot more confusing, but it seems very recently, like I think a couple months ago, Laura sent me an article, that androgen may increase the risk of breast cancer, but only if there's no endogenous estrogen. And then Catherine already told you about the Wisdom study, which is basically longitudinal nationwide study that compares that annual screening I talked about earlier with a more personalized screening recommendation that takes in a lot of other factors into consideration. And I've put the eligibility requirements on the right to really highlight what we started out with is asking for people who identify as female and we present ourselves as a women's health study. And starting in 2018, Wisdom really began to grapple with what that means. And that's both part of the top-down initiative. So the University of California system was asking for studies to take into consideration or to categorize both sex and gender, but also as a bottom-up initiative from transgender women writing into the Wisdom study and requesting to join. So that really brought me to my initial research question, and with my experiences and people I love their experiences, which is how do we understand breast cancer risk amongst transgender communities? And then as I went into it more, starting with literature review, I did a series of interviews with experts and the Wisdom team. I began to really look into, what's the best method of research to address this question, and then how can we incorporate transgender people and gender diversity into existing women's health studies? So the first part of my question has a deceptively simple answer, which is how do we understand breast cancer risk? Is that anyone can have breast tissue regardless of their gender, and so anyone can develop breast cancer. However, there are a lot of other factors that do influence it, and we should really focus on that personalized precision medicine perspective to pinpoint what are the factors that influence breast cancer risk and how can we better understand them. So that brings me to basically my literature review, which was, there's not a lot of literature on this subject, and my main resource was a study from the Netherlands in 2019. I've included the incidence ratios for the epidemiologists on the Zoom, and for non-epidemiologists like me, I kind of summarized it by
essentially showing that transgender women after taking estrogens tend to have a higher risk of breast cancer, and transgender men after taking testosterone tend to have a lower risk of breast cancer than cis women. However, there's a lot of information missing from this analysis. Length of hormone therapies that were taken, what surgeries people had, how genetic factors such as BRCA1 and 2, CHEK, and SNPs interact with sex hormones to influence risk as well. So again, this is just a summary of how we could best get that data. My literature review, really every article I read suggested that we need longitudinal studies with large-scale population-based cohorts, and that have the ability to analyze both genetics and hormones. So you may have guessed the answer just from all of our conversations, but what did that make me think of? The wisdom study. And so I wanted, before I really dove into wisdom, I wanted to understand, is this the best way that we should be addressing research for transgender people? Are there other studies that better target the population, and should we focus on that? So throughout my interviews, I got basically that we need all of these methods to really get a fuller picture of what's going on. So I think the most resounding theme that came out of my study was that cisgender breast health research and transgender breast health research are not as separate as we might think. Cisgender and transgender people largely have the same care. They largely use the same hormones. And when we investigate these smaller populations like transgender people, we will get a fuller picture that really encompasses and improves our risk assessments for everyone. And that population-based studies are really important, along with more specific studies, because it improves those studies' results as well, and it's more representational of the US population. So this is just a brief summary of some of the information wisdom could incorporate. So experts really suggested getting more information on the different types of hormone therapy that was used, when people started taking those therapies, and specifically how long they were on. Taking organ inventories, and so having a full list of which body parts and organs that the participant currently has, especially those that affect what sex hormones are in the body. And then also differentiating between masculinizing surgery, which leaves some breast tissue that can still develop tumors, versus a prophylactic mastectomy, which completely removes any breast tissue. And I think in the future, once we get to analyze this more, we could really look at how we can alter our risk recommendations to make them more personalized for transgender people, as they already are for cisgender people. So our current model doesn't have data on transgender people, it only uses information from cisgender people. And so potentially we could use those relative risks that I used earlier as a multiplier to alter it. So and then, so with all that, now that I confirmed that wisdom was a great opportunity for people, I wanted to understand how we could welcome people in. And so throughout my interviews, I got this metaphor that wisdom opened the door for transgender people, and it could also welcome them in more intentionally. And we can see this with the numbers. So out of 45,000 people enrolled in the study as of last week, there are 22 transgender women. And that's 0.048% of the wisdom cohort, which is 10 times less than the proportion of transgender people of a comparable age range in the United States. So identified some challenges, such as, there's public backlash that transgender health is facing right now. It's difficult to teach people about gender identities, and transgender people are afraid of interacting with their providers or disclosing that they're transgender. It's dysphoric for transgender men to come into a clinic that says it's for women or that's all pink. And so those are huge barriers, not to mention lack of health insurance, but there are also opportunities there. I think staff and providers can really collaborate with transgender health experts and improve not just some of the data we collect, not just our understanding, but also we're part of the cultural narrative. We really shape how the larger public perceives transgender people. And so we can make transgender people feel safer coming into the clinic. We can inform people that gender is part of biology. And we can also leverage that there are transgender women out there who want to join. That is very affirming for them. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I also think of what Spider-Man says, which is with great power, with great opportunity comes great responsibility. This is a map right now. There are over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills proposed in the US this year alone. And that is much higher than last year, and last year was the highest year on record. So every year it's increasing, and as you see, California is one of the lightest states there, which means we have the least amount of anti-LGBTQ bills, and I think we have a responsibility being in California, being in San Francisco, to really invest in research that is not only competent and treats transgender people well, but is also compassionate and understands what's going on. And I think Wisdom has a particular benefit because even though we're based in California, we provide recommendations to transgender people across the country. This could be the opportunity for transgender people in Tennessee or in South Carolina or in Colorado to really actually get the care that they need that they're not getting in their home state. So thank you all so much.
Wisdom's based in, I mean, our site's in California, there's the study based in California, right?
It's a nationwide study.
It's a nationwide study. And so what is the hallmark of Wisdom? You provide what kind of recommendations? Same recommendations or?
Personalized recommendations.
Okay, so what is the rate of men to get breast cancer relative to the rate of women?
1 in 830.
So it's 1 in 100. So it's 100-fold lower. What's our threshold for recommending certain screening? The average risk of what? So it's 1.36. Would a man reach that risk?
Not necessarily, unless they have to.
So if we really wanted to be more thoughtful, we could actually have gender-based, trans-based recommendations. So anybody who's going female to male who takes testosterone probably wouldn't reach the threshold for screening. And someone who is male to female, while their risk is higher, just calculate whether they would reach the average age, the risk of an average individual.
I think with this,
I bet they probably would not. So that's actually something to calculate. So I think in some ways, being thoughtful about it, you know, we made the decision to make it open. And regardless, it's such a small group, it's hard to actually fulfill recommendations, but maybe a better way to do it is just put some information on what we estimate the risk to be for someone who doesn't have a mutation, who's trans. And I mean, first do the calculations. It's not that hard to figure it out, but I would bet you that I can make a threshold for what we consider certainly in the next iteration. Wisdom maybe not make the risk threshold. And that may be a good start. And that's actually information just from the data that you have. And in fact, testosterone is actually incredibly misrepresented. That's one of the things we've learned from the transgender, the female to male transitions from this people that surgery rejects out. That's one of the reasons why we're going to consider a cast using a testosterone-based product to try and reduce risk. So it's pretty exciting. But anyway, I think yeah. So I think we could probably organize something that will explain just
yeah,
would actually reduce people's anxiety.
and so an exciting part of my study is that I found some transgender health providers who want to work as a good business stuff too.
Well, yeah, because I think I'm gonna have actually not make a question. Should actually just have. All right, let's see who's anyone on chat. Nope. Thank you so much.
Oh, I get another one.
You can get this one.
No, but
One at the beginning and one at the end. Okay, Tamia. Now we're going to move into transition into our way in which we think about collecting data for care and trials and thinking about how we can use it to integrate and make moves.
Okay, so I will take it away. Hi, everyone, I'm Tamia. I worked on one source with Laura and Adam this year, and it was absolutely amazing. The one thing that I learned was never, ever, ever stay in your lane. I think I maybe embody that sometimes, I don't know. But wonderful. So I'm going to take a little bit of my talk to explain one source. And so maybe throw around the term every once in a while. Maybe you're just like nodding your head, smiling like you understand it, but we're just going to break it down for you. So with a patient in clinic, we have a lot of patients in the BCC. Let's say they come in, they see multiple providers, whether that be a nurse practitioner, a surgeon, an oncologist, and they get a lot of we get a lot of information from those patients. That being their family history, social history, etc. Let's say said patient is chosen to be eligible for a clinical trial. They go onto the clinical trial, and we get also information from them within the clinical trial. But in the first instance, we're in the clinic and we're entering a lot of that information into APEX or EPIC, our electronic health record system. In the second instance, we're getting information from patients within the clinical trial, and that's getting inputted into a separate database. So we have these two independent systems where we are collecting and inputting all this information. But what if, instead of these two individual systems, we had one source? That would be amazing, right? Yeah, great. And so the idea of one source is that we have this intersection between care and research. We're able to have multiple opportunities to collect data from patients and use that in real time to learn about our health system and to push the entire field of research. So that is, in essence, one source. What I'll be talking a little bit more about today is what that looks like from the pathology perspective. And once again, if you're sure about pathology, that's really what we would consider our single source of truth. So patient gets chemotherapy, maybe something super specific. How is it that we know that they need chemotherapy? Why did they get hormone therapy? It's all going back to pathology. For clinical trials, how is the patient determined to be eligible? Pathology and amongst a bunch of other things as well. Even on tumor board, when we're talking about the aspirin adjuvant list or the pass sheets that I create every once in a while, all of that is going back to pathology. And so what we really want to make sure is that this pathology that we use to inform clinical decisions and the pathology that we use to talk about patients and what their course of treatment looks like, we want to make sure that that's structured in a way that's usable and usable and accessible to everybody in the BCC and the whole nation, of course. Next slide, please. So we'll be talking a little bit also about like our one source timeline. So I manage the pathology database right now, and the first entry I believe in the database is dated all the way back to 2000. So there's a lot of information that we can use. Started by Dr. Wong, who is one individual of BCC. Fast forward a decade, a SPY opens. Fast forward another decade, we have electronic patient reported outcomes that launch on iSpy. And then we're sort of at this point where we're trying to transition what was our Excel database to something that's a little bit easier and accessible for everybody. But the essence of this slide is to say that we have all of this information at our disposal. We want to make sure, once again, that pathology is used in a way that's structured and accessible to everybody. Next slide, please. So what does it look like right now? It's a little finicky right now. So this is an example of one of the pass sheets that I and actually athletes as well will use and submit to tumor board. And this is how we sort of review patients that have had surgery within a given week. And so you'll see the little bubble or empty field there. That's where we enter all of our information. All of those values that are put into those little bubbles are pulled into our Excel database, which is, you know, nice and dandy, but it's a little bit difficult to sort through because if you kind of look at the top, it's a little difficult to see, but it kind of lists exactly what the procedure is. So let's say a patient has a bilateral mastectomy. That can be written in about 500 different ways. So they can say B/L mastectomy, BL mastectomy, it can be uppercase, lowercase. We get all these different variations. So when Dr. Muthar or Dr. Wong ask me to search the database, and they're like, how many patients have had a bilateral mastectomy? I don't really know because it's a little hard to sort through. And so ideally we have some sort of structured way to actually use this information. And once again, with this past system, there's a lot of errors. I'm human. You guys, I hope we're human as well, so we make little mistakes every once in a while. But once again, hopefully we're structuring our database in a way that makes it so we have a little bit more efficiency when we're trying to transfer this information. So previous system, looking towards the left here, is me pulling data from our electronic health record system, APEX for Epic, and putting it into that Excel database. Right now, I'm pretty much the only person that accesses it, and once I leave, Abby will more than likely be the only person that accesses it. So when anybody needs anything from the pathology database, they pretty much have to go through me, and then I access the database. Ideally, we're going to use transition system on Open Clinica, our electronic data capture system, and we're at least doing a little bit of damage control. Of course, there's still a possibility of error, maybe even using this structured form, but ideally, we at least have some consistency in the way that the values are set up and in the way that we enter information. And so with this transition system, we're cutting out, me, myself, and I, the middleman, and trying to transition it to where at least everybody can access this information, whether it be myself, another researcher, a clinician like Dr. Esserman, or a fellow who's at the Breast Care Center. Wonderful. And so all of that leads to our future system. And ideally, what we want is not to just be in this transition system on Open Clinica. Ideally, we have the pathologists themselves enter that information into a shared system that combines both research and care, to where everybody can access this information, and it's entered once and used how many times? Many, many, many times. Fantastic. And with this new system, we'll mitigate a bunch of errors. So once again, superhuman. Of course, when I put in errors, or not when I put in errors, but when I make errors in the current pathology database. Ideally, with this new system, there's a direct transfer of information from the pathologist into one source. So once again, that data is accessible to everybody. We're building a repository that's, able to push the field of medicine so that so many different patients can inform their clinical decisions, and we can identify the right therapies for the right patient, right time, and optimize responses and minimize adverse events. And all of that will help with our multidisciplinary communication as well. And that, everyone, is one source in the pathology aspect. I just want to say thank you to I think it got cut off a little bit, but this has been a wonderful experience. I want to say thank you to Dr. Esserman, Adam as well, our one source team, specifically Gary, Lisa Weiss, Kevin, and then also this wonderful, 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 the best cohort ever. Sorry, you guys. I've had like the absolute best time here, and not to like talk about where I'm from, but I'm from the East Coast. And so I don't know, I just didn't know how things would be over here. I was like, super excited, but I think it was like way past what my expectations were. So I had a fantastic time with all of you. And I hope you guys have a great time without me though. That's how I do it. So thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things, one of the ironies is that those pieces of data that you want are actually in the pathology note. It's called the structured report, right? Synoptic note. So it's required to be structured, but how is it entered as discrete and it's just text? That's the irony of it. So people don't want it, but they have to follow this template. So there's just no reason why, if they did that, then you guys would get to spend your time doing something better than harassing the pathologists. But, and so once we have it though, I think one of the things that, if we really have this, we have, how many people, 10,000 people?
Yeah, I just looked this morning, I think it's about, I think it's 8,000, that's all of them.
But, we can look at the outcomes for all those patients. Yeah. And so you could actually take, someone comes into the clinic and you want to say, how many people came in at 41 before someone or two positive notes and what was their outcome? You can ask SPEAR, you can ask our own database. Depending on the results, you can share information. But, but again, and you could look at iSpy too. I mean, there's different ways you could look at that and see, how are we doing? That would be, I think, a very cool thing. But once you have that, Molly and Abigail Molly, well, I'm certain by the Yes.
You got it.
Good answer.
Fantastic. All right. Anyone, any questions on chat? Great. Okay. On the home stretch. You're remarkably on time, I have to say.
Hi everyone, I'm Kevin, and I'm also here to talk about OneSource. Before I go on, the lesson that I've learned this year is to not be too afraid to loosen your personal boundaries with people that you work with. I came in here with this really gung-ho attitude of thinking like, oh, I'm gonna separate work and my friends and my personal life, and they all blended together, and it's been an absolutely amazing time since then. Yeah. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'll be talking about OneSource and integration of care and research. So quick background and overview. Mia did a great job explaining what OneSource is, so I'm going to just breeze through it. You've seen this slide before. I imagine OneSource as this big technical umbrella or an electronic data capture system that kind of streamlines the integration of clinical data, patient-reported data, and research data all in one place. And in practice, OneSource can be accessed in a tab in the EHR. It's incredibly difficult to see here, but once you enter OneSource through the EHR, providers can access and enter clinical and patient data, and researchers can pull any kind of relevant data that they want from the EHR. So the entire premise of OneSource is built on this enter once, use many philosophy, where providers only have to enter valuable information once for many others to access. So why do we want this? First of all, it saves providers time. They no longer have to spend the hours that they spend scouring the Epic and gathering bits and pieces of information from different encounters. Rather, this information will be already gathered into an intuitive interface on OneSource, of providers and CRCs can spend more time on analysis and spend that time with patients. Second, it also eliminates the propagation of errors. Tamia talked a little bit about this, but just by the logic of having all the information in one place, entered only once, to be verified, there's just far less risk for typos or any kind of transcription errors. And third, it also sets up the ability to track interventions and outcomes. Simply having all the relevant data aggregated in one place allows you to do this. And finally, this technical umbrella provides for a seamless implementation and assessment of innovative quality projects. So I also wanted to touch briefly on the OneSource journey from its ideation by Dr. Laura Esserman to its implementation over COVID through iSpy COVID, as well as for iSpy 2.2, and currently where we are, which is trying to get OneSource implemented as a prototype within the realm of a CIS diagnosis. And in the future, we're hoping for a full integration of OneSource in the EHR and within our clinical workflow. So I'm sure you guys have all heard this. Every good idea needs a pilot. So for this good idea, my pilot is going to be working within ductal carcinoma in situ, or DCIs. So my short-term goals for this pilot or this proof of concept is to build out technical requirements for implementing OneSource in the clinic for DCIs patients, developing a breast lesion map in order to prototype its function and usability in the clinic workflow, and to ultimately track redundant data entry for providers and researchers who are involved in any kind of DCIs care here at BCC. Our long-term goal is to integrate the breast lesion map as a proof of concept for effectiveness and the feasibility of broader implementation of OneSource, and to also perform data analysis and tracking how much time it's actually taking for providers. So our methodology was a qualitative one. We shadowed and interviewed providers and hospital staff at every point of care for BCI's patients. Then we got all this interview data, synthesized it, identified some key themes, and we tracked each data element that's utilized in BCI's care for the patients to identify any kind of redundant entry and redundant access. That's all. So we were able to synthesize our interviews with the nurse navigator, nurse practitioner, resident plastic surgeon, and the radiologist and rad-onc by using these classic notes. Each classic note represents a data term or a data element that we were tracking. So we were assigning it to different people and when they were accessing it at what point of care. That's like. So we decided to do a little bit of quantitative analysis. As you can see, I just took a small snippet of our interviews from radiologists, and you can see that like terms such as imaging date, laterality, and modality are physically entered 3 separate times into the EHR by 3 separate providers. So like these are the kind of redundancies that we're trying to get rid of, and now that we've identified them, that's the next step that we're going to be looking towards. This is also another really big next step that we have within the next year. We're trying to build out the technical requirements for this breast lesion map that radiologists and surgeons and NPs can use. This kind of just represents what we could do when all the data is aggregated in one place and when everyone is contributing to data in one source. That's it. And finally, Tami and I also worked on the standardization of accepted data elements via the US CDI, which is the US core data for interoperability. And this essentially allows vendors like OneSource outside the EHR to compete to optimize data aggregation. And this was a very meaningful and important step. We talked about it at Specialization as well. So finally, one more slide. For next steps, this is our vision for OneSource implementation in the clinic. When a patient first comes in the clinic, depending on whether they're looking for a diagnosis, treatment, or seeking follow-up, providers will establish a specific patient summary within OneSource that will reside within OneSource and can be written back into the EHR. Then during treatments, depending on whether or not they already have imaging or biopsy data, the breast lesion map that I showed you guys previously will be created or updated. And meanwhile, the CRCs and any kind of research scientists will have access to the same organized data within OneSource, which will save them tons of time. So, finally, I'd like to acknowledge all my mentors, Dr. Laura Esserman, Adam, Justin Wong, and Marie, and all my collaborators, and all the BCC interns. Thank you all so much for a wonderful year. I couldn't choose a quote, so I just, left for
What would you go for,
I think
Laura?
there's an Obama further up, but I have to crop him out.
There is McConnell there. All right, so, yes, and if people don't know, Kevin is also. So after our retreat, we sort of broke things up into 3 phases of care. So we're sort of focused on data much, but I think there was a really interesting way of sort of thinking about 3 steps of care, right? So visit preparation, what to do within the consultation itself, the next steps, or whatever, and then follow-up. And so what we have here is so the first 2 probably are these are the visit prep, that's the visit prep. And then our second 2 are
it's like the actual care. Yeah.
Then we need to sort of organize a follow-up. And then we have to decide what measures are measures, right? That's always the hard thing, because that's actually like no one's doing that, right? So it's not that you have to, you have to say, well, how would I even know? How would I measure the quality of my care? How would I, like, we're busy documenting what we do, going for it, moving on. But so the quality of your care is like, It's not that you are careful not to measure a particular outcome, because if you get bad outcome, you want it squelched, you won't be able to prove it, right? So if people will, still have to work to have something they want it, but it's like the ability just to have that process. So I think, just thinking about it from Saturday, how do we kind of organize what are the steps that have to happen before a visit? And where do they happen? And, the idea is we would love to have all this to be easily organized and structured within the EHR. Is that the way you do that? Yeah. So the idea is to be able to have it easily done in some other system that drops it back. So then at least you have it. One more iteration, I think, and I don't know exactly the outcomes are going to think about it, but I think everybody and what they're thinking about and all the pieces that they're working on. Kevin and I were just talking about that because there's so many ways just today to think that everyone's working on so many different pieces of the puzzle, and everyone has little pieces of it. And you can see even in our own groups how we can get up coordinated and ask the same things over and over again. How to get our distress number. Are people given choice for active surveillance? Is it better? Is it less? Is it worse? That's a good idea. So, I certainly got from your presentation that needs to be part of everything we do, not just when we recur. Do they have pain? Do they have this? Do they have, that what are the standard things we should think about? So I think it'd be good actually to have a long-term meeting, to sort of think about it. Maybe that's going to get here. Should have done actually before you guys left, but that's it. We can invite you wherever you are, but once people are kind of into another month or two, just really a good time thinking about it. Taste for the cure when we're trying to organize the taste for the cure. We'll start thinking about what are combined things we should do in those three. Everyone in just be thinking about it yourself. What's the ideal preparation for the visit so that all the information is there when we need it, both about patient's state of mind, your state of their health, what the actual data is that's been given to you, so that you can confirm it and organize it during the clinic and come up with a plan. And then what do you need to do to follow up? And how are you going to measure? How are you going to measure your outcomes or of what you do? Those are things to think about, so that we can work on that on Facebook here, just because I think it's a good time for everyone to go. Work in progress. One more, that's yours, yes. We have one more, and I think Alex is tape, right? Where is his on the desktop?
Yeah, it was the last slide.
Alright, I just see what ship sounds.
Yeah.
Is this the sound?
The sound is lower.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So.
This one?
Yeah. Yep.
So that's really interesting. Let me just go back to this one.
Oh, I was thinking something. Sorry. Yeah.
Ethnicity and surgical literature. But before we begin, I want to share the most valuable lesson I learned during my time here. The lesson is simple yet powerful, and it is to jump in and to not be shy. What I learned here at the BCC extends beyond the realm of breast cancer or my assigned role as I-SPY COVID intern. In fact, they hold immense scalability and applicability across the diverse healthcare settings. Now, as my time comes to a close with the BCC, I will now present my final project. It does not relate to COVID since I presented a COVID project last year, but this time, like mentioned before, I'll present disparities in race and ethnicity in surgical literature. This is very important since there is insurmountable evidence that support that there's a disparity and is not representative of our diverse population. So further ado, let's begin. So as mentioned prior, in the United States, disparities in health continue to be a significant issue, preventing access to quality care. Varying outcomes can vary based on race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. Therefore, trials that shape care must be representative of the population encountered in clinical practice. For this project, my team consisted of the following members: Ali, Ellen, Mikhail, and myself. Our project aimed to examine the reporting of race in surgical literature and assess the representation of different ethnic groups in surgical trials. But first, let's discuss the methods of this project and how we set it up. We collected US-based studies involving human subjects published between 2014 and 2022, specifically in journals as shown in the slide, such as JAMA Surgery, Subsurgery, and so on. The inclusion criteria encompass the following: randomized control trials, human subjects, and clinical study, and a first report of commentary on the clinical trial. For those who do not know what a randomized control trial is, it's simply put a prospective study that measures the effectiveness of a new intervention or treatment in comparison to other interventions or control groups. We selected these inclusion criteria based on the potential to inform care and the ultra significant control of the patient population. This approach will allow us to analyze the studies that were most likely to yield meaningful insights into representation of race and ethnicity in surgical literature. Now moving on to the next slide, let's jump into what was collected in each study. The data collected for each study was the following: the year of the publication. This was collected to observe trends and changes in the representation of time. Affiliation of senior author. This was collected to see if the author's affiliation provide insights into the study, and also to collect location. Funding, to see if there was a trend of government or industry funding on reporting race and ethnicity. And of course, race and ethnicity to receive the representation. And lastly, sex and gender to see if there's any disparities in representation in that as well. By collecting these specific variables, we aim to determine and understand the representation of race, ethnicity in surgical literature and see if there are disparities. Now for the results. So we'll be covering race and ethnicity, such as is it being reported, and also the representation and gender for today's presentation. To start, to the left, we count if race is being reported or not. We counted +1, aka yes, if they just reported at least one racial group. To better enhance our understanding, I transferred a table to a visual to the right. Based on this result, it appears over the years, the reporting of race ethnicity has increased over the time period we are investigating. Now we have to examine the representation in different racial and ethnic groups. On the left, we have our findings, while on the right, we have the U.S. Census Race and Ethnic Report for 2020. It's important to note the percentages don't add up to 100%, as individuals may report more than one ethnic group or race. Interestingly, comparing the results to the census, we found that it closely aligns to the diversity of the U.S. population. Lastly, our group reviewed the representation of gender and saw there's a slight male predominance that could possibly relate to disease burden. To conclude my presentation, we have completed data collection for a time period 2014 to 2022. The results show that the representation of racial and ethnic groups in surgical trials is relatively close to the U.S. population. This is different from the previous study in the medical field, where people have found underrepresentation of racial and minority groups. It's also important to note that our study is not over. We have decided to expand our study period further, so we will be collecting more data, and it will be really interesting to see if the result is different or the same. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for tuning in to UCSF BCC Intern Class Final presentations. Thank you.
The disparities panel or the Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation. It turns out that 3/4 of studies, these are of all of the drugs that were approved by the FDA in the prior 10 years, less, I think less than a quarter even reported race, and enormous disparities in those trials. I'm actually really surprised by this data. It's one of the reasons we did it is we thought it would probably be the same. It's interesting, surgical trials are kind of different from drug trials, and device trials are just different, and it's easier to get a broad swath of people, I think, to participate. I'm actually glad to see it, but it's like that's one of the reasons why the legislature passed a bill requiring FDA to track it and require people. So about 50% of people still didn't report it. So again, that's just some studies that right, but it's better. At least that's better than drug trials. But again, I think the reason it's concerning is that the trials that are for drugs often haven't been studied in the populations that are doing. So that's, I think, a big deal. I think the FDA is threatening not to include them for all populations. We don't start paying attention to it. It's not going to happen overnight. And then so I think that, again, this is what you know. Again, for devices, where they're being studied in, and they're being studied in whoever picked up. I have to get the slides to see, but it looked like the Asian population was pretty low. The Asian population for the country is much higher than 5%, right? It's like 20%. In California, it's about 30%. So, let's see, but I think it's very interesting at which groups are underrepresented, but that's why you look. And it is actually what will make the difference is that big journals say if you don't have a recent first population in trials, we won't publish. That will motivate people to. All right. Well, what a fantastic day. Shockingly, we are on time. That is emotion.
Nice job, Anne Marie.
Yeah. Hand out books to the new turns, and we'll have to set a date for our book club on 2 or 3 months to read it. Molly, Abigail, Molly, and this one is Abigail's. There's Serena. And let's see. Anna and Natalie is over here. Natalie's and you and Astrid and Maya and Karen. All right, everybody. I think I hope let's give and Sai, I have I'll get you yours. It's I'm waiting for a drive. I'm waiting for one more package. It's Anne Marie, Jeff, you, and anyway, I'm gonna give you mine, but I think that much. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here and supporting. Thanks again to all of the mentors. You know, it's a joy, but it's work. You know, so make sure you ask your mentors to pay attention to you. That's the best way to get things done. Don't worry about it being frustrating. That's how you accomplish things, and that's how they accomplish things. I hope you are all new turns are suitably inspired by the old turns, and I hope you are all inspired by our sparking innovation and healthcare value. I hope you learned a lot. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm inspired to do things. Just like another block. But all right, without support. Anyway, we are enormously grateful to all the hard work of all of the interns who've been here. Those of you who are leaving, we will miss you. We'll see you at the next intern reunion. For those who are staying, we are very grateful to have the overlap and have people making sure with those who are the anchor from one class to the other. We always need that, so thank you for being part of that. We're excited about all the new things to come and all of the exciting projects in store. And I'm sure you're all talking. I hope you've absorbed everything you possibly can. Mentors will train you. And Jeff, I think they are suitably trained. We're ready to go for.
Oh, almost. We have training mid-July, 17th.
Ultimate.
Coup de grace.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. And